Hi there, I'm Tim Gray. For years I've been helping photographers achieve better images through my books, magazine articles, workshops around the world, and video training with the help of Video to Brain. We tend to take a very wide view of the world around us, looking at broad landscapes, for example, but in this video course we're going to take a much closer look at our subjects through macro photography. We'll start off by taking a look at the equipment that we'll use for macro photography. That includes, of course, cameras and lenses, but also other accessories, flashes, and other tools that we might use in order to achieve macro images. We'll then take a look at some of the ways we can light our subject, sometimes just using ambient light, possibly employing reflectors, or utilizing flash to really take full control of the lighting on our subjects. We'll then explore some of the issues related to composition. How are we going to approach the subject, framing up the subject in the camera, just thinking about how we can produce a more interesting image as we're taking that close look at the subject. Depth of field is one of the biggest challenges we face in macro photography, specifically that it's very difficult to get an adequate depth of field for the subject since we're focusing so closely on it. We'll take a look at a variety of ways that we can deal with this issue of depth of field. Finally, we'll explore a series of photographic projects where I'll take you along and show you step by step all the tools and techniques I'm going to use in order to achieve a particular photograph that I have in mind. I encourage you to grab your camera and get out there to take a closer look at the world around you through macro photography. Photography makes use of equipment, and when it comes to macro photography, that's even more the case. We're really much more dependent upon the particular equipment that we're using. Some of that, of course, is just general photography equipment, and some of that is very specific to macro photography. So I wanted to take a look and give you an idea of the equipment that I'll be using as part of this video workshop to capture my macro photographs. Of course, it all starts with a camera, in this case a digital SLR, that I'll be using to capture my images, and I can certainly use a wide variety of lenses with that digital SLR. And of course we need digital media cards to store the images on that we're capturing with our digital camera. I use a wallet that contains these digital media cards, and a nice little trick that I use is to turn the card backwards in the wallet when it's been filled so that I know this is a card that needs to have the images downloaded to the computer, and the other card, which has the label facing forward, is a card that's ready to be used. I also want to carry plenty of spare batteries, and that's especially true with macro photography because I'll tend to use the live view display on my digital camera. That's the LCD, and it consumes a fair amount of power, so I tend to go through a lot more batteries when I'm shooting macro than I do with other types of photography. So I want to make sure that I have at least 1 or 2 backup batteries and that all of the batteries are well charged. I also always carry around some tools for cleaning the camera, a lens cloth for cleaning the lens itself, and when I'm in the field I'll also carry a lens pen which enables me to clean not only the lens but also the image sensor inside the camera if I get a little bit of dust on it, for example. Now, I can use a variety of different lenses for macro photography, and in fact they don't necessarily need to be macro lenses. Here I have, for example, a 24 to 105 millimeter lens attached to the camera. It will focus reasonably close, but I can get it to focus even closer through the use of an extension tube. And this is a very inexpensive way to allow a normal lens to focus much more closely, making it in effect a macro lens. Now, it doesn't give you quite the same quality that a macro lens would give you. You're losing a little bit of light in the process, but all things considered, it's a good solution if you don't want to spend the money on macro lenses. You might also consider renting some lenses. Services such as borrowlenses.com enable you to borrow at a relatively inexpensive rate some lenses that you might not feel are within your budget. Now, speaking of lenses, for macro lenses, I'll tend to use a 100 millimeter macro lens for much of my macro photography. At 100 millimeters, rather than a more typical 50 millimeter lens for macro photography, this gives me a little bit more reach. Of course, the compromise is that I'm getting less depth of field. So I have more working distance. I'll be able to be a little bit further away from the subject, but I'm also going to be challenged a little bit more in terms of depth of field, a bit narrower depth of field because of the longer focal length. But it's a great lens, very sharp lens, and I use it quite a bit for macro photography. Another favorite lens of mine is the 65mm, the 1x to 5x lens. This allows me to get very, very close to the subjects, literally taking images from 1x, in other words, where the subject itself is actual size on the image sensor, all the way up to 5x. So very close magnification. It really opens up a whole new world in terms of photography. Now, with many of the subjects, of course, we're going to be shooting at relatively slow shutter speeds because we want to stop down the lens in order to try to get greater depth of field. And so a tripod really becomes a critical piece of equipment for macro photography. I personally prefer to try to avoid using a tripod whenever possible because I like to be a little bit more flexible in terms of being able to move around the subject and reframe the subject. But with macro, that's just a little bit too much of a compromise in terms of image quality. At those slower shutter speeds that we're likely going to need to use in many cases, it's simply not advisable to use macro photography handheld. Instead, make use of a tripod, preferably with a ball head so that you've got a little bit more flexibility in terms of moving the camera around. In addition to the ball head itself, I'm going to use a plate on the underside of my camera to mount the camera to the ball head, but in many cases I'll take that a step further and also use a focusing rail. The focusing rail allows me to turn a dial to move the camera closer to or further away from the subject. The camera itself will mount onto the focusing rail, and then the focusing rail will mount onto the ball head on my tripod. And once I've got basic focus established, it's very easy to adjust focus in very, very small increments just by turning a dial. So that's a very handy piece of equipment, especially with a lens such as the 1x to 5x, where I'm working very, very close to the subject. I've got high magnification. The depth of field is usually very, very small, so I really need the precision that a focusing rail provides. In addition to using that tripod, sometimes I'll need to stabilize a subject, and so I use an articulating arm. This is a clamp, and it has a clamp on one end and a more gentle clamp on the other. The idea is that I can attach that clamp to the leg of my tripod and then adjust the position of the arm as needed and use this other clip to hold a variety of things. It might be, for example, a flower that I'm photographing. I could also use it to hold a reflector or some other piece of equipment that I'm using, and so that's a very handy tool used in conjunction with the tripod. Especially when I'm using the clamp, but for just about all of my macro photography, I'll tend to use a cable release. And this allows me to remotely trigger the camera. When I've got the camera mounted on a tripod and I'm zoomed in very close to the subject and depth of field is very narrow, I don't want to do anything to upset the position of the camera. I don't want to move it a little bit closer or further away because that'll cause problems in terms of focus. I don't want to shift it one way or the other. I don't want to accidentally put too much pressure on the tripod and push one of the legs into the ground, for example. There are a variety of things I can do to inadvertently change the position of the camera, and one of the ways that I can help ensure a sharper image and a lack of movement of the camera is with a cable release. Once it's plugged in, I don't have to touch the camera in order to trigger the release of that shutter. I also carry a couple of very important tools that relate to the use of the ball head on my tripod for the plate attached to the camera as well as that focusing rail. One of those is an Allen wrench, and that allows me to remove the plate from the bottom of the camera, for example. In many cases, you'll have Allen screw nuts that you'll need to tighten or loosen. I also carry a coin, and that is especially important for some of the attachments. For example, the screw on the bottom of the focusing rail has a very large slot. You could certainly use a large screwdriver, but most small coins will fit very easily and serve perfectly as a screwdriver for that purpose. So definitely want to carry a little bit of spare change in the camera bag as well. In many cases with macro photography, I'll also need to use some supplemental lighting, and that can take the form of just a basic flash that'll sit on the hot shoe of your camera. Certainly in many situations that'll work out well, especially when we're working with longer lenses such as the 100mm macro lens. But also in certain situations we're going to be very close to the subject, so when I'm using the 65mm, the 1x to 5x lens, I'll use either a ring light or a twin light setup, and this is also just a regular flash setup in terms of mounting to the hot shoe, but in this case we have a couple of lights that are attached to a rig that will affix to the front of the lens, and then I can adjust the position of each of the lights independently. In the case of the twin light, or with the ring light, I've got diffused light all the way around a ring, and that puts light right on the subject where I need it. So very handy in situations where I'm very close to the subject that I'm photographing. When using flash photography especially, it can be very helpful to develop a black background. That'll often happen automatically with flash because the light falls off and doesn't reach whatever's in the background. But if you want to be really sure that you get a black background, I'll often carry around a black t-shirt or other piece of fabric. You just want to make sure that it is not shiny fabric so that it won't reflect light back to the camera. And so a regular t-shirt works absolutely great for that purpose. I'll also carry with me a reflector, and that actually serves several purposes. I'll go ahead and open up the reflector here so that we can get a better sense of some of the possibilities. Now, I generally use a rather large reflector because it gives me just a lot more flexibility. It might seem a little bit silly when I'm dealing with very small subjects and I'm very close into those subjects, but a large reflector is much more useful even if it's far away from the subject. And so you can see here I have a silver reflective material on one side, and then on the other side a black material, which is great for blocking the light to the subject and making sure that I'm not reflecting any additional light onto the subject. I can also reverse the material here, and you'll see that I have a gold reflector and then a white reflector on the inside. And if I remove the cover altogether, then I have a diffuser, so something that allows me to just cut back the light a little bit. So this is a multi-use reflector. It actually serves several purposes that are very, very handy in macro photography. And of course, I could use other objects to shield the light from the subject, but also to block the wind. And that could be just a simple tray or other objects, just a board that you've got, or even the lid. I've got here a plastic lid that works really well for blocking the wind. So I can just place it very close to the subject, making sure it doesn't get into the frame, and that'll prevent the wind from moving the subject around, at least to some extent. And of course, oftentimes macro photography takes us down low to the ground, and so having a cushion to kneel on can be very, very helpful. Makes it much more comfortable to work when you're photographing those subjects near the ground. And of course, for all of the equipment, or at least most of the equipment, you'll want to make sure that you have something to put it all in so you can get out into the field and back again. And so some form of a backpack or a camera bag that you can use to put your lenses and camera and other equipment into makes things a lot easier as you're moving around in the field looking for interesting subjects, and even just to keep that equipment safe. If you're photographing in a studio environment, even having that backpack there so that you can put your lenses away, put your flashes away when you're not using them, makes sure that that equipment stays safe. So hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the tools that I'll be using in this video workshop and some of the tools that you might consider in your own photography as you explore the world of macro. I have to admit that most of the time when photographing, I prefer to work without a tripod. I like working handheld because it gives me a lot more flexibility in terms of my composition and my photography in general. But when it comes to macro photography, being without a tripod is really not a very good idea. In most cases, you're working with such a narrow depth of field that you need to stop the lens down quite significantly, and you're going to end up with relatively slow shutter speeds as a result. So you really need to be on a tripod to ensure stability for the camera. Now, taking a look at the tripod, of course, we've got 3 legs. That's why they call it a tripod, and that gives us quite a bit of stability over the ground. I like to start off by extending the legs as much as I need to. I'll start at the top and work my way down when extending the legs, and start with the bottom and work my way up when I'm collapsing the legs. And generally, I'll get the legs all the way extended, or extended to the point that I think is going to be adequate for the subject. I'll just assume that I'm going to photograph the bark of the tree here, and so we'll get the tripod set up relatively high. You might notice that this particular tripod actually has a center post. I like having a center post on the tripod because it allows me to elevate the camera just a little bit more. I'm a little bit tall, and I oftentimes photograph subjects that are at eye level, and so having that center post can be very helpful. The trouble is, for macro photography, very often you might find that you want to get low to the ground, photographing flowers or insects, for example, and this can actually be a liability. That center post can be a liability because it means you can't get the tripod too low to the ground. Generally speaking, you'll be able to extend the legs beyond their limits. There'll be a little lock mechanism of some sort so that we can then extend the legs outward. And if we do this for all of the legs, then you can see that ultimately we could get the tripod to be relatively flat to the ground. But in this particular case, using this tripod, because of that center post, I'm going to be about a foot off the ground even at the lowest level. So a little bit of a compromise in this case, and it just depends on your tripod. So you might think about that if you're purchasing a new tripod. We'll go ahead then and get things set up. You'll notice that the ground here is a little uneven, and I generally want the camera to be relatively level. In some cases, perfectly level. For macro photography, that tends not to be too critical, but it's still helpful if for no other reason than to ensure better stability for that tripod. If the ground is higher on one side, that's going to tilt the tripod a little bit, and it will be more likely to tip over sideways. And so in this type of situation, I'll then lower one of those tripod legs so that I can get the base of the tripod as close to perfectly level as possible. So that's going to look a little bit better. On top of that tripod, I have a ball head, and I prefer to work with a ball head rather than having various knobs to adjust, tilting each axis independently. In this particular case, using this ball head, I can rotate the entire construct, and I can also adjust with the ball head, moving the camera, twisting it around in all sorts of different directions. And I employ a quick release to make it very easy to attach the camera and take the camera off the tripod when I'm finished. So I'll go ahead and attach the camera here, and I can aim the camera at my subject and then tighten things down once I have everything exactly where I'd like it. Another thing that can be very, very helpful, especially if it's even the least bit windy, is to provide a little bit of additional weight. I'm using a carbon fiber tripod. I got a carbon fiber tripod because it's lightweight, which makes it easier to carry around and travel with. That also means it's a little bit more susceptible to motion in the case of wind, for example. And a very easy solution, if you have a center hook, is to simply hang a backpack or other bag right from that center hook. And that's going to give a little bit more weight to the tripod, make it a little bit more sturdy so that you don't have to worry so much about vibrations and movement caused by the wind or other motion. And even just my touching the tripod with that extra weight, it's got a little bit more mass. And so moving the camera, adjusting settings on the camera won't cause quite as much motion for the camera. So with that all set up, I'm ready to finalize and get my camera set up for my photo, and I'll be able to achieve better results, a sharper image, even if I need to use a relatively slow shutter speed, thanks to that stable platform for my camera. As photographers, we tend to enjoy exploring the world around us, looking for interesting subjects. And when you find an interesting subject, for example, let's assume that I want to photograph the leaves on this tree, you might be tempted, or you might have the habit of just approaching the subject and pointing and shooting without giving much thought to how you're positioning yourself, how you're setting yourself up. And that can be problematic in any situation, but especially with macro when we're dealing with a much smaller view of the world, more narrow depth of field, and slower shutter speeds in many cases. So we want to think about our position, how we're positioning ourselves. When it comes to the stance, I often think of the analogy between a monopod and a tripod. With our feet close together, we're like a monopod, not terribly supportive for the camera. Whereas if we take a wide stance, that's more like a tripod. Now we're producing a good platform for the camera. We're spread out and we've got some nice stability, so we're not going to be moving around quite as much. We've got better balance. We can also think about our arm positioning, bracing our arms against the body, for example, so that we have even greater stability. Sometimes it's not exactly easy to do or very practical, but whenever possible, try and think about that arm position. There's also a couple of tips that relate to an analogy with shooting a firearm. And this is an apt analogy, I think. We do call photographing shooting, after all. And there's some tips from shooting a gun that can actually be very, very helpful for photographers. One of those is to think about your breathing. Actually timing your photograph with your breathing. Specifically, to breathe out and then photograph at the bottom of that breath. In this particular situation, I was walking down a trail. Maybe I had been hiking, for example. I might be a little bit winded, and so it can be good to take a moment to calm down, to let your breathing come back down to normal. Take a deep breath and try and calm yourself down a little bit, but when you're actually taking the picture, take it at the bottom of that breath, right at the end of your exhale. And much like when shooting a firearm, we want to let the trigger, in this case our shutter release, surprise us a little bit. So don't just press the shutter release all the way down, but rather squeeze it rather gently in a rather slow process so that in effect the shutter release actually surprises you. When that shutter mechanism opens up to expose the image, it actually comes as a little bit of a surprise, and that's going to help ensure the sharpest images possible because it helps ensure the most stable platform possible. So let's take a look here. I'm going to get a nice wide stance, hold my elbows up against my body as best I can, and then frame up my subject and slow my breathing, and then at the bottom of an exhale, I will squeeze that shutter release and let it come as something of a surprise. I don't know exactly when that shutter is going to actually trigger. So using those little tips can help you produce a more stable platform, and that will help produce sharper photos. With macro photography, your choice of lens is actually quite important. Not only do you want to think about the fact that you're using a macro lens ideally, but also the focal length of that lens. There are a variety of different focal length lenses available for macro photography. Some common examples include a 50mm, for example, or a 100mm lens. And so you might wonder, how do you go about making a decision between particular lenses of different focal lengths for your macro photography? I'm going to demonstrate the concepts here using a non-macro lens, in this case just a 24 to 105mm lens, and photographing a nice flower subject that I've found here. Now, if I were working at my widest focal length, in this case a 24mm focal length, and I wanted to fill the frame with this flower, I'd have to get down to this level. So you can see here, just a few inches above the flower in order to fill the frame, and that's at 24mm. Now, if I zoom in to 105mm, now you can see at this point, I've filled the frame with the flower and I have a much greater working distance. And this can be beneficial for a variety of different situations. Number one, it just makes it a little bit easier to work. You don't have to be right on top of the subject, but rather you've got some distance there. You can be a little bit more comfortable. And with some subjects, that can be especially important. For example, photographing insects, if you get too close, you're likely to scare that insect away. And so having that additional working distance can be particularly helpful. And of course, if you're photographing reptiles, some dangerous subjects, it's even more important because you want to be back a little bit further for your own safety. Of course, there's a price to pay with a longer focal length. When we're using macro lenses, we're already dealing with issues related to depth of field. We're going to have a very narrow range of the subject in focus at any given time. And we want to try to maximize that depth of field in most situations. Now, if I were shooting this flower, if I was photographing the flower looking straight down upon it, it's essentially a plane here, and so depth of field is not a major consideration. I've got a reasonably narrow range of the subject there, and so a narrow depth of field won't be problematic. But let's say, for example, I had a flower with a fly perched on top of it, and I want to shoot across that flower. So I was going to set my camera up something like this, shooting across the top of that flower, and I've got, for example, an insect perched on the flower, and I want everything to be in focus. Now, depth of field becomes a very significant consideration, and that focal length, using 100mm focal length versus 50, for example, is going to impact that depth of field. With a longer focal length, I'll have less depth of field. And so when I'm very close to the subject, that's going to be a little less problematic. When I'm close to the subject, I'll get greater depth of field with that shorter focal length lens. And so it's always a compromise. When I use a longer focal length lens, I do get a little bit more working distance to the subject, but I also get less depth of field. When I'm using a shorter focal length lens, I'm going to be closer into the subject, but I get more depth of field. So it's a compromise that you need to think about when you're choosing which equipment to buy and which equipment to use for a particular shot. In talking to photographers, I find that there tends to be a lot of interest in photographing macro and close-up subjects, and that one of the barriers to their actually photographing these subjects is the cost of the equipment. Macro lenses tend to be relatively expensive. We're not surprised when a long lens, for example a 500mm telephoto lens, is expensive relative to a shorter lens. But with macro lenses, the cost is quite high compared to lenses of a similar focal length that are not macro lenses. There's simply a lot more engineering that goes into a macro lens, and that affects the price. You're probably familiar with the behavior of many of your lenses by now, and you realize that in many cases, the lens is simply not able to focus very close to a subject. I'm going to photograph a newspaper here just to illustrate the concepts of a unique solution that might help you out at very little cost. I'm going to photograph this newspaper, and what I'm going to do is set my focus to the closest focusing point. The funny thing is, with this particular lens, this is just a 24 to 105mm lens, it actually labels that as macro. And yet, at that focusing point, the closest that I can get to this newspaper and stay in focus is right about there. So that is my close focusing point. And that's actually not very close at all. In fact, I'm able to see most of the page of the newspaper. However, I can use an extension tube to help me focus much closer on my subject. This extension tube simply moves the lens further away from the camera body, changing the focus point. So I'm going to put my lens cap back on the camera. I'm going to make sure that the camera is turned off so that any dust that might be floating in the air is not going to be attracted to the image sensor with static electricity. I'll take that lens off, and then I can mount the extension tube directly to the camera body, and then take my lens and place that lens directly onto the extension tube. And so you can see that now my lens is still mounted to the camera, it's just mounted a little bit of a distance away. Extension tubes come in a variety of sizes, 12 millimeter, 25 millimeter, even 50 millimeter. In this case, I'm using a 25 millimeter extension tube that gets my lens 25 millimeters away from the camera body. And now let's take a look. Once again, focused at that macro setting, at the closest focus point, let's see how much closer we can get to this subject. Go ahead and turn on the camera and take off my lens cap here. And moving closer and closer and closer down onto the newspaper. Now I'm getting to the point that I'm casting my own shadow onto that newspaper, so things are a little bit dark there. And taking a look, I now have about 4 lines of text in the newspaper included in the frame, whereas before I was able to see almost the entire page of the newspaper. That gives us a very clear indication of just how much that extension tube helps us focus more closely. And because we're able to focus more closely on the subject, that means that we're able to get very, very close and therefore achieve a macro photograph without the expense of a macro lens. You might also consider renting lenses just to get a better sense of using a real macro lens, a bona fide macro lens, which will give you better image quality. So services such as borrowlenses.com can help you with that, giving you the opportunity to shoot a lens for a few days to compare for yourself. And I encourage you to compare the difference between a macro lens and a standard lens using an extension tube. You'll most certainly find that you get better quality with a macro lens, but if you don't want the expense of a macro lens, an extension tube will give you good results very, very cheaply. I absolutely love autofocus, and in fact, because autofocus was originally introduced when I was just a child, for my entire photographic life, I've been able to put autofocus to use. To me, it makes things much, much easier. Not that I want to depend upon autofocus, but I certainly want to put it to use in order to help ensure the sharpest images under a variety of circumstances. But that all changes with macro. When I'm shooting macro, I will always shoot with manual focus. And the reason for that is that autofocus is going to tend to not get just the right spot. So for example, I have some lichen here that I found on this branch that I'd like to photograph, some nice yellows and greens. I think it makes an interesting subject, a very tight shot with just those subjects in it. And so if I were to put the autofocus to use, the problem that I'm going to run into is it's not going to focus on the right spot necessarily. And because I'm dealing with very narrow depth of field whenever I'm shooting macro, that's likely to be a significant issue. In this particular case, I have the yellow lichen roughly centered and the green lichen over toward the right side of the frame. And because I'm not able to achieve a very deep depth of field, even in this case shooting at f/16, I'm still not going to have everything absolutely in focus. And so I want to focus my attention, I want to focus the lens on that green lichen, letting the yellow lichen fall off out of focus into the distance. However, because of its position, if I use the autofocus on the camera, I'm going to end up focusing on that yellow lichen. Now, of course, I could move the autofocus point over to the right. I could focus on the third side of the frame, over on the right-hand side, about a third of the way in from the edge. But the problem there is it's still not necessarily exactly in the right position. I want to be very particular in this particular example of getting the tips of the lichen plant here in focus. And I might be able to get that with autofocus, but the odds are not really with me. And so it's much, much better to simply utilize our manual focus. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my focus here. And they're turning the dial here just a little bit to get the green lichen over on the side in focus. and that gives me a much better result. So if I was using the autofocus, I'm not going to have an easy time. And of course, I don't want to recompose either. It would be theoretically easy to just point the camera over to the right just a little bit, focus on that lichen, and then turn the camera, but there's considerable risk there. If I can simply rotate the ball head, that might not be too problematic, but the distance to the subject can change even in that case, especially when I'm working so close to the subject. So I might use autofocus when shooting macro just to get an initial focus, just to get the lens focused to the approximate range that I need to focus on, but then I'll absolutely put that manual focus to use in order to ensure that the exact spot that I want in focus is going to be in focus. Achieving accurate focus is critical in macro photography. Of course, accurate focus is always important in photography, but with macro it's especially challenging because we're generally dealing with very narrow depth of field, and so the margin of error is quite small. Using the focus on the lens itself sometimes just doesn't give you quite the degree of control, and also sometimes you really need to make larger movements of the camera. And so rather than relying exclusively on the focus on the camera itself, on the lens, I often like to employ a focusing rail. And this is a rail that the camera can mount onto. It allows me to move the camera forward and back relative to the subject, which makes it much, much easier to get accurate focus. So I'm going to go ahead and take the camera off of the tripod here, off the ball head, and I'll remove the plate that's on the bottom of the camera, which allows the camera to be mounted directly to the quick release on the ball head itself. And then I'm going to replace that with the focusing rail itself. So attaching the focusing rail directly to the bottom of the camera. I want to make sure that it is straight, that the focusing rail is straight, so the camera is going to be moving directly forward and aft. And I'll use a coin here to tighten up the screws so that the focusing rail is attached firmly to the bottom of the camera. I can then take the plate that I use normally to attach the camera directly to the ball head and attach that plate directly to the focusing rail. So once again, making sure that everything is nice and straight and tightened down nicely so that the camera will be very, very stable. I can then take this assembly, the camera attached to the focusing rail, attached to the camera plate, and put all of that onto the quick release for my ball head. I'll need to turn the ball head in this case and go ahead and mount. And then I'll get my camera approximately into position and lock the ball head, at least temporarily. And I can now release the lock on the focusing rail. Since I'm going up and down in this case, I want to make sure I'm holding onto the camera firmly so it doesn't slip, but I'll release the lock mechanism on the focusing rail, and now I can adjust the position of the camera as needed in order to achieve approximate focus. So at this point, I'll go ahead and adjust the focus and then adjust the position, releasing that locking mechanism to adjust the camera to an approximate position that will work well for the subject. But now I can fine-tune the position to achieve a very good result. I'm going to go ahead and block the sun here so I put the camera in the shade and I can see the LCD a little bit better. I'll turn on my live view display, and now I can use the knob on the focusing rail. I can turn the screw here to move the camera closer to or further away from the subject in order to achieve very, very precise focus. So I'm able to move the camera in very small increments, essentially turning a screw that pushes the camera toward or pulls it away from the subject, giving me tremendous accuracy. That looks to be pretty good. I'll make sure that my exposure settings are established as I want them. I'm going to use a cable release in this case. Since I've taken the time to fine-tune the position of the camera, I don't want to inadvertently move anything, so I'll use a cable release to trigger the exposure. I'll go ahead and shade the subject here, and that looks good, so I'll trigger that cable release, and we've got the photograph. So I've achieved a nice photograph with sharp focus by using that focusing rail to help me fine-tune focus for the image. One of the recurring themes in macro photography is depth of field. Because of the nature of macro lenses, we're generally dealing with a very narrow depth of field. And that means we're going to tend to want to stop down the lens a little bit in order to achieve greater depth of field. The problem is when we stop down a lens, when we make the aperture smaller, we're going to also need a slower shutter speed, a longer exposure. And that means if there's any movement in the subject at all, it's going to be rendered as a blurry area in the image. That can obviously be very problematic. It might lead you to increase the ISO setting, for example, in order to achieve a faster shutter speed. But a higher ISO setting can lead to noise. So you can see it can be a bit problematic dealing with this issue of depth of field. And so generally, we'll want to try to stop down the aperture the minimum amount necessary in order to achieve adequate depth of field. But it can be tricky to calculate depth of field when we're dealing with a depth of field that is literally a fraction of an inch. And so we need a tool that will help us evaluate that depth of field without necessarily needing to take a picture just to determine what that depth of field will be. The depth of field preview feature on our cameras can help us with that scenario. I have a subject here that'll work out pretty well to demonstrate the concept of the depth of field preview. I've got a rose set up and I'd like to photograph the rose petals. There's some nice water droplets on them, but I have a fair amount of depth here. I would estimate that the area that I want to photograph, the total depth is maybe about 1/2 inch to 1 inch, and so I want to make sure that I'm going to have adequate depth of field. When I look through the viewfinder, it doesn't look like I have much depth of field at all. But that's because by design, when I'm working with my camera before I take a picture, the aperture is wide open. It's not stopped down to what it will ultimately set to based on my camera settings. So looking through the viewfinder, I'm always looking through a wide open aperture. That's providing more light to the sensor, it's allowing me to focus much more easily, but it also means that I don't have a sense of what the final image will look like in terms of depth of field. I have a depth of field preview button, but this actually can be a little bit problematic. When I look through the viewfinder and then press the depth of field preview button, what I'm ending up with, in this case, I'm operating at an aperture of f32, maximum in terms of being stopped down. When I press the depth of field preview button, I pretty much can't see anything at all through the viewfinder. I've darkened it down so much because now I've taken that wide open aperture and I've stopped it down to the smallest possible aperture for this lens. And so the depth of field preview seems to be not all that helpful. In fact, pretty much useless in this particular case. Fortunately, I have a live view feature on this camera, and so I can turn on my live view and then observe the image on the LCD display on the back of the camera. And now when I press my depth of field preview button, I do see that changed depth of field, the expanded depth of field, which shows me in this case that I have more than adequate depth of field for the subject. And also I get an exposure simulation, so the image is not darkened down the way it would be through the viewfinder. I can see the actual final image in effect in a preview form without even having to take a picture in the first place. And in this case, it tells me that I don't need to stop down all the way to f32. I'll go ahead and adjust my aperture, and we'll take a look again using the depth of field preview. I'll adjust my aperture to about f22, and that looks to be adequate in this particular case. I don't think I have to stop all the way down. I'm going to increase my ISO a little bit. I think I'll take it up to about 800 ISO. Still a little bit high, still risking a little bit of noise in the image, but I'm able to achieve in this case, with a little bit of exposure compensation, a 1/20th of a second at f22. 1/20th of a second is still a little bit slow, but I've got a stable setup. I'm working on a tripod. I've stabilized the flower with my clamp here, and so I think that that 1/20th of a second is going to be more than adequate. I'll go ahead and capture an image here. So I'm able to use that depth of field preview not just to get a sense of what the image is actually going to look like, but also as a tool to help me fine-tune my camera settings to get the very best results. Macro photography requires a certain degree of precision, a little bit more precision than most photography, I would say. We're very limited by a variety of factors. For one thing, the focal length of the lens and our desire to have the subject framed in a certain size within the frame can present challenges in terms of positioning. We'll be very limited in terms of our specific positioning to the subject, both in terms of the distance and the angle as well to that subject. That often means if we're using a tripod that we're a little bit limited in terms of where we can place the tripod, the height height of the tripod, etc. And in turn, that means that our position ourselves is going to be a little bit constrained. In this case, for example, I can't get too far over because the brush is here, and I'm going to have to squat down just a little bit to be able to put my eye to the viewfinder. So all things considered, a little bit more constrained than I might be with other types of photography. We can take advantage, though, of live view to make things a little bit easier if your camera is so equipped, and this camera is. Now, what live view is an ability to display what the camera is seeing, what the image sensor is seeing, directly on the LCD display. Now, this might not seem all that impressive, as many point-and-shoot cameras for years have had this capability. In fact, some point-and-shoot cameras only have the ability to watch the image on the LCD display without even having a viewfinder at all. But it actually is sort of a big deal for SLR cameras. In order to see the image on the LCD live as we're viewing it, we need to move the mirror up out of the way and have the shutter open so that the image sensor is reading that signal constantly. Sort of like a video camera, essentially, which really is what we're achieving then, essentially a video camera that is displaying directly on the LCD display. And that makes it much, much easier to both frame up our subject and adjust our focus. Now I have a larger image to view, and I can observe that image as I fine-tune, for example, my positioning in terms of the camera. And so I'll go ahead and adjust my tripod position here and get the camera adjusted just the way I'd like to frame the subject. And then as I'm manually focusing the lens, it's much easier in most cases to see that focusing on the live view display itself rather than looking through the viewfinder. Of course, in bright sunny conditions, you might need to have a shade of some sort so that you can better see that LCD, but I think it's still much, much easier to work with this live view display, both for composition and for focusing. So now getting things just fine-tuned, I can also see a lot more readily just how much the subject is moving. In this case, the plant is getting pushed around a little bit by the breezes, and so I can just stand here and watch. Now in this case, because the subject is moving just a little bit, I'm going to fine-tune my focus as I'm working, and I'm also going to use a cable release in order to capture the image. And this makes it a little bit easier for me in terms of my position, but it also ensures that I'm not going to bump the camera, moving it ever so slightly relative to the subject. So generally the way I'll work is to get my subject framed as accurately as possible and then fine-tune the focus, and when things seem to be perfect, in this case waiting for the subject to not be moving, then I'll press the shutter release on my cable release, and that looks really, really nice actually. And I can always make fine-tuning adjustments, for example, adjusting my aperture. Maybe I want a little bit more depth of field, and so I can adjust my aperture setting and again wait for the subject to not be moving, fine-tuning the focus. Keeping in mind, with macro, I'm working with a very narrow depth of field in many cases, even when I stop down the lens, and so just a very small movement of the subject can make a really big difference in terms of what's in focus. So I always want to be paying very close attention to that focus, and I'll fine-tune and fire away another shot. And that looks very nice as well. So using that live view display can be very, very convenient in terms of being able to work a little bit more comfortably, but also helps you ensure better results, being able to get a better sense of exactly how the subject is framed up and whether or not it's in accurate, sharp focus very, very easily. So I try to use the live view display in a variety of situations, but especially with subjects where things are a little bit more critical, where I feel that the framing of the subject and the focus is going to be key to my final result. Every now and then with macro photography, it's nice to get a helping hand, and sometimes that comes in the way of a clamp of some sort. In this case, what's called the Plamp from Wimberley. It provides me with a way to get some level of stability. I can clamp this attachment to my tripod and then stretch out the arm here, and I have another clamp, and this clamp on the end is very gentle, and so I can actually put plants, even the stems of flowers, into this clamp. In this particular situation, I found some nice leaves that I'd like to photograph, some fall leaves that had fallen on the ground, and it's still attached to a bit of the branch, and so I can attach that with the clamp right in front of the camera. Now I've also used this clamp, as I mentioned, for wildflowers, but also to position a small reflector or a shade, a diffuser, all sorts of utility with this handy little clamp. And so now positioning the leaf in front of the camera, I'll go ahead and I'm going to turn on my live view display because it'll make it a little bit easier to adjust my focus and fine-tune the position here. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when you're working with a device like this, it's attached to the tripod. So everything I do that's moving the tripod is also going to move this arm, which means, and you can see happening here, every time I touch the camera, that leaf is going to be moving. It's going to be shaking just a little bit. It's bad enough that I'm outdoors and I need to worry about the breezes, but all of my movements with the camera are also going to cause a problem. So I'll need to be very careful as I'm making my adjustments here. I'll go ahead and get the camera positioned, and then holding the cable release in one hand, I'll adjust my focus with the other hand, make sure that my exposure settings are all optimized, making sure to stop down, for example, to get enough depth of field. Here I have a relatively flat leaf. I don't need to stop down too much. I think I'll try and work at f8 in this particular situation because that will make sure that I can get an adequately fast shutter speed, even if there's just a little bit of motion in that leaf. And so fine-tuning my focus, that looks to be pretty good. And now hands off. Normally I would tend to keep my hand very close to the lens when I'm using this device, the Plamp, because those vibrations are going to move the leaf around. Every little touch of the camera can cause a little bit of motion. I'm actually going to wait and try and get to a point where I have no motion in the leaf, and then I'll trigger with the cable release. And in fact, it's very important in this particular case when I'm using a Plamp to work with that cable release, not to touch the camera pressing that shutter release button, because that will impart some vibration to the leaf. You can see the leaf shaking here. And so I'll wait for that vibration to stop. Go ahead and make sure that I'm in focus once again. And then hands off, wait for that motion to stop, and then trigger the shutter with the cable release. So you can see that using a Plamp or other similar devices can be very, very helpful for positioning the subject exactly where you'd like it, perhaps making sure that it's backlit versus front lit or side lit, or also using it as an accessory to hold a reflector or diffuser, etc. But it can be a great helping hand for macro photography. If your close-up and macro photography takes you outdoors, then the wind is going to become a problem, even if it's only a very slight wind. In this case, I'm photographing some grasses here that look very, very beautiful. The problem is that they're on a very tall stalk and the top very easily catches the wind. So it doesn't take much of a breeze at all for this plant to start moving around a little bit. And that's going to become a problem in any circumstance, but especially with macro photography, because I'm very close to the subject, and so that movement is essentially magnified. I'm also working with a relatively narrow depth of field, which means I want to stop the lens down and I need to get a faster shutter speed to compensate for that movement. That also means I'm likely to want to increase my ISO setting, which increases the risk of noise in my capture. And so all around, photographing with any breeze whatsoever when you're working with a macro subject can be quite challenging. But we can actually work around that to some extent by using something to block the wind. Now, you might use a reflector, for example. In this case, I just have a plastic lid, and what I can do is place that aside the subject, of course blocking whichever direction the wind is coming from. In this case, the wind is coming largely from my left to my right, and so I can position that wind block as close to the subject as I possibly can without getting it in the frame. And so I'll want to make sure, in this case I'm going to use the live view display, and I'll make sure that everything is in nice and sharp focus, and then using my cable release, I'll once again position this wind block as close to the subject as I can. Oftentimes what I'll actually do is actually move it into the frame until I can see it, so I get a better sense of just how close I can move it in until it becomes a problem, so that I can get it as close to the subject as possible and then wait for the breeze to subside. Now, it's important to keep in mind that anything you use to block the wind is not going to block the wind completely. As the wind passes around the opposite side, it's going to have a little bit of a vacuum effect, sucking the subject away from the wind block, and so it's not a 100% solution that'll work perfectly in all circumstances, even with a light breeze. You could possibly use a wind block on both sides, but regardless, there's going to be some movement of the air, and so you'll still want to capture several different images and wait until you can see that the subject is not moving at all or is moving very, very little, and adjusting, taking into account that movement with your exposure settings. So possibly still increasing your ISO a little bit, maybe not stopping down as far as you might otherwise, so that you can still achieve a reasonably fast shutter speed. But by blocking that breeze just a little bit, you're not going to need to use quite as fast a shutter speed as you otherwise would have needed in order to photograph the subject. As photographers, we naturally think about exposure generally in terms of two factors, the shutter speed and the aperture. In other words, how large is the aperture in the lens that we're using for an exposure, and therefore how long do we need the shutter to remain open in order to produce a properly exposed image. With digital photography, we also have the variable of ISO. In other words, to what degree are we going to amplify the signal for the imaging sensor in order to simulate the effect of more light. With macro photography, those three factors become much more critical. We're going to need to make a lot more compromises, and so we can't really just think about one or two of those settings, but really we need to think about all three at all times when we're shooting macro. I found an interesting knot in the wood here, and there's some lichen or moss growing around it, some yellow colors, and it produces some interesting textures. I'd like to photograph that very, very close up. I'm going to use a close macro setup, and this is going to actually exaggerate some of the problems that we'll have in terms of lighting a macro subject and producing a proper exposure. I'm going to go ahead and get adjusted here. I'll use the live view display. So that I can make my adjustments. I'm going to tighten up my composition here, getting very, very close to the subject. In this case, with this lens, it looks like I'm at about 2.5x. In other words, the subject is magnified by a factor of 2.5. I'm going to fine-tune my focus here using the focusing rail, and at the moment I'm shooting in aperture priority mode just to give me a little bit more flexibility, and I have the aperture set to f2.8, essentially wide open for this lens, and at 100 ISO that's giving me a shutter speed of around 1/6 of a second. Well, I'm on a tripod, I'm using a cable release, so 1/6 of a second really shouldn't be a problem in terms of the exposure. The trouble is, at f2.8, I can already see, based on the live view display, that if I have the lichen or the moss here in focus, then the wood itself will be out of focus. That's how tiny the depth of field is at f2.8. And so I need to stop the lens down a bit. I'll go ahead and take this down to, let's start with f8, and I'll use the depth of field preview here to get a sense, and that looks pretty close. I don't think we've got perfect focus on all areas of the image, but we're pretty close. So let's take a look then at what the shutter speed does, and we can see we're at 1.5 seconds of shutter speed. That's not terrible in terms of exposure, again, using a very stable platform, but that could be a little bit problematic depending on the circumstances. For example, I might get some vibration. The boards here are a little bit loose. This is an old structure, and so the wind might move that around a little bit. Maybe the footing underneath the tripod is not perfectly stable, so I might get some motion there. There are a variety of factors that could cause a little bit of softness with such a relatively long exposure. And in this case, to make matters worse, I think I really would need to stop down to about f16 in order to get adequate depth of field for the subject. And at f16, that's taking me up to about a 6-second exposure. That's a very long exposure. Again, with a stable platform, probably not too big an issue, but it still makes me a little bit nervous to have such a long exposure when focus is so critical. I want a very tack sharp image. And so then I can start thinking about increasing my ISO setting. And here it is very helpful to think about stops of light. Every time I increase my ISO setting, I'm increasing the amount of light effectively. Now, not literally, because really what we're doing by increasing ISO is amplifying the signal that's being received. But we can think of it in general terms as though we were using a longer exposure without actually having to need to use a longer exposure. So for example, going from an ISO setting of 100 to an ISO setting of 200, my shutter speed then can go from a 6-second exposure down to a 3-second exposure. That's one stop, twice as much light, and so my exposure can be half as long. And I could continue increasing ISO. For example, in this case, I would be pretty comfortable using an 800 ISO setting with this camera. That's going to start to give me some visible noise, but not so problematic that I can't deal with it in post-processing. And if I bring my ISO setting up to 800, then I'm going to have a shutter speed that's more around a half of a second, in this case 7/10 of a second at f/16. And that makes me feel a lot more comfortable under the circumstances. There's a little bit of a breeze here. Again, the boards are not terribly stable, and so I'm a little bit concerned about movement, even though I have a very stable platform to work with. So with the focus established, in this case focusing on the lichen there on the wood and using f/16 about 3/4 of a second in terms of that exposure, and that gives me a good image with adequate depth of field, but also taking into account all these other factors. It's worth noting, by the way, take a look at the position of the lens relative to the board. One of the challenges with macro photography is that we're getting very, very close to the subject. With a 100mm macro lens, for example, we might be able to get a little bit further and get some working distance, but in many cases, we're getting very close to the subject to the point that the lens itself actually blocks a lot of the light from the subject. So we need to think about all of these factors, the ISO setting, the aperture, and the shutter speed, all three combined when trying to figure out which settings are going to produce the best result to give us the best exposure for our photograph. So I found a cool subject here. I've got a spider in a web, and he actually has some sort of other insect that he's caught. I'm not sure exactly what it is anymore, but it looks like a really interesting subject, and I'd like to photograph him. So I've got my tripod set up. The trouble is, this is a subject on the move, and that presents particular challenges for macro photography because we're dealing with such a small angle of view. We're dealing with a very small area, and if it moves, the spider moves just a little bit, it will quickly be out of frame. And depth of field, of course, is a serious consideration. Now, a moment ago, the spider was perched a bit higher here, up near the other flowers, and so my camera was trained on it. We were ready to go, except then the spider moved down, back down to the center of the web here where his food is located. And so now I've got to try to recompose, and that presents a real big challenge as far as using the tripod. Now I need to try to move my tripod, reposition the camera, in this case get it down significantly lower, all without disturbing the spider, because the moment I bump one of the leaves over here or one of the edges of the spider web, that vibration is likely going to cause the spider to run back up to the edge of the web. And so using the tripod here is a pretty significant limitation. It's obviously a huge advantage in terms of being able to use a slower shutter speed, for example, being able to get greater depth of field by stopping down the lens, but with a subject that's a little bit on the move, that becomes a bit of a challenge. Now, when I'm photographing the subject from here, I'll go ahead and just recompose slightly to check my exposure. And in this case, I actually don't need too much depth of field, but at f8, I would be shooting at about a 1/15 of a second at 100 ISO in this particular case. That's not too bad. If the spider is holding still for a moment, I can probably get away with that, but of course, I would like to get a faster shutter speed, all things considered. And if I decide that I'm not going to use the tripod at all, it becomes even more problematic because now I'm going to be moving. I can only hold so steady. So let's go ahead and take the camera off the tripod here. I'm going to leave the tripod where it is because I don't want to disturb the spider again. And if I try to shoot this handheld, now, again, coming in close to the spider here, and at the moment in this particular position, I'm metering at f8 and 1/8 of a second. That's very, very slow, especially handheld. In this case, I'd rather have at least 1/25 of a second, and ideally a bit faster. And so what I'm going to need to do is increase the ISO setting rather significantly. There we go. And so now at f8 with a 1600 ISO, I'm able to get a shot at 1/25 of a second, and that I can comfortably hand hold. Generally speaking, I still need to be very, very careful about holding very steady when I photograph the subject, but at least with that higher ISO, I'll be able to get the shot. Now, if I use the tripod, I could certainly use a slower shutter speed a little bit more comfortably. Again, I still need to be concerned about the movement of the spider. If there's a breeze moving that spider web, for example, or if the spider's moving around at all, that would become a problem even at a reasonably fast shutter speed. A 60th of a second might even be a little bit too slow, depending on how fast that spider is moving. And so even on the tripod, I might need to use a higher ISO setting in order to achieve an adequately fast shutter speed. But handheld, that's a particular problem. Now, one of the other issues when shooting macro, again, our depth of field is very, very narrow, and so we're going to have to move quite a bit. In essence, I'm becoming my own focusing rail, adjusting my focus, but also moving back and forth relative to the subject, closer to the subject and then further away from the subject, and that presents its own problems in terms of motion. And so I need to focus on trying to be as still as possible. I need to get myself positioned as accurately as possible. I need to consider my ISO and my aperture and my shutter speed all at the same time in order to produce an optimal shot. So when I'm shooting handheld, I'm likely going to need to increase the ISO significantly in order to get an adequately fast shutter speed and adequate depth of field by virtue of stopping the lens down. And that does mean I'm going to have to deal with some noise after the fact, but that's better than not getting the shot at all. In the context of macro photography, you might have heard of the term effective aperture. With macro photography, our effective aperture is essentially 2 stops darker than a normal aperture with a typical lens. And I'd like to demonstrate this concept for you using actual lenses so you get a better sense of exactly what this means. I'm going to set up the camera here. I'm using a non-macro lens to get started with, and I have essentially a gray card that I can use to measure exposure in a very controlled way. I'll go ahead and get things set up. I'm working in my manual exposure mode. I happen to have set the ISO to 400. I could use any ISO setting here that I'd like. And I'm going to adjust my aperture to f5.6 and centering the meter, adjusting my shutter speed so that I get an even exposure based on the metering here. I have 1/45th of a second at f5.6, again with ISO setting of 100. Well, that's with a normal lens, a non-macro lens that I'm metering off of this gray card. Now I'm going to take an extension tube and add that to the mix. I'll place the extension tube in between the lens and the camera, moving the lens further away from the camera. Bear in mind, this will enable the lens to focus closer than it otherwise would be able to. In other words, for all intents and purposes, converting a normal lens into a macro lens of sorts. So I'll go ahead and turn off the camera and then remove the lens, add the extension tube to the lens itself, and then take that whole assembly and attach it to the camera. Now turning the camera back on, I will once again meter off of this gray card, very evenly lit surface, and at the exact same exposure settings with an ISO setting of 400, an aperture of f5.6, and a shutter speed of 1/45th of a second, I'm indicating now an exposure that is 1.5 stops underexposed, so a darker image essentially using the same settings, which means just by adding that extension tube, I've lost 1.5 stops of light. And really, all I've done is move the lens further away from the camera, and so the light that's being projected is being allowed to fall off a little bit more, to the tune of 1.5 stops of light. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the camera and remove this lens assembly with the extension tube, and let's consider a macro lens. Remember that a macro lens is designed to allow us to focus very close to a subject. We've accomplished that using an extension tube with a normal lens. A macro lens accomplishes all of that right inside of the lens itself, and it's using optics in order to achieve a much higher quality than you might get with a normal lens using an extension tube. So I'm going to place this lens now onto the camera, and I'll turn the camera back on. So the effective aperture really relates only to how much light is reaching the image sensor. So at f5.6, 1/45th of a second would not be an adequate exposure. Let's assume a case of f4. We're really going to achieve an exposure as though it were f16, as though we had stopped the lens down 2 stops, but we are not achieving greater depth of field as a result. This doesn't affect the way you configure your camera in terms of the exposure if you're using metering. You'll simply meter based on the light that's going through the lens. So generally speaking, it really doesn't change your behavior as a photographer. It's just a good thing to be aware of. When we're shooting macro, we're going to lose about 2 stops of light with most macro lenses. That means we're going to need longer exposures. We might need to increase ISO. It's a good concept to keep in mind so that you'll have a better understanding and appreciation of some of the things we need to do when it comes to exposure for macro photography. I found some leaves that are nice and backlit against the sky here, and I'd like to photograph them. So I've gotten my tripod set up and I'm ready to go, but I noticed that there's a small breeze and that the leaf is moving a little bit. Now obviously I can increase my ISO setting. I've already taken it up to 800 ISO in this particular case, and I can try to minimize the degree to which I stop down the lens. Since the leaf here is relatively orthogonal to the plane of the lens, I don't need to stop down too far. I'm just going down to f8 in this particular case, and I think that'll work out okay. But my shutter speed is still relatively slow. I'm down in the 20th of a second, sometimes as fast as a 60th of a second, depending on how much sun is coming through from the background. And that's really not quite enough considering that there is some level of movement in the leaf itself because of the breeze. And that's where a cable release can really come in handy. I actually use a cable release for most of my macro photography just because it makes it so much easier to work and more comfortable to work as well. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in the cable release to the side of the camera here. And I'll make sure that all of my camera settings are configured exactly as I like them. And the way I generally work when I'm working with a cable release for a macro subject is I'll use one hand to fine-tune the focus after already composing my scene, adjusting the position of the camera, for example. I'll go ahead and adjust my focus, but I'll keep that left hand very close to that focusing knob. When I'm actually taking the picture, I want to let go of the camera so I don't unintentionally move that camera around or impart some vibration to the camera. And in my other hand, I'll have my cable release. And so I'll watch. In this case, I'm using the live view display. If you don't have a live view display on your camera, you could certainly look through the viewfinder, but it's also a good idea to keep some attention paid on the subject itself and watch for the point where that subject starts to slow down in terms of its movement. Here, the concern is the breeze pushing the leaf around, and so I'll wait until the breeze seems to have subsided a little bit, and I'll adjust my focus and wait for it to stop moving just a little bit more here. We're slowing down, and right about there, I think we got a shot that is relatively sharp. In this sort of situation, you're probably going to want to take several images, several captures of that same subject. It can sometimes be difficult to tell until you really zoom in on your photo whether or not you had any motion blur at all. And keep in mind, when the subject is moving, even when it stops moving, it might not stop in exactly the same position. And so I'll still want to adjust my focus and even reevaluate the composition. If I had things set up in a particular way, I might need to readjust the position of the camera. Here, I think my position is okay, but I definitely am needing to refine my focus a little bit. And I'll continue adjusting focus, trying to keep the subject, the leaf in this case, in focus throughout all of its movement. So once it seems to have stopped, I'm pretty well focused. I'll continue to fine-tune, get that focus just right, and then wait for the subject to not be moving at all. And sometimes that lack of movement is just for a very brief moment, and so you'll want to be ready with that cable release, ready to fire off the shot. But the point is that in a variety of circumstances, and especially for macro photography, you'll find that that shutter release, that cable release, is very, very helpful in terms of being able to focus your attention on different things, on the subject, on the focus, on the composition on your LCD, and then you're always at the ready, able to trigger the shutter release without actually touching the camera. So you're not going to move the camera around, and you're able to work a little bit more comfortably with your subject. Generally speaking, when photographing macro subjects outdoors, I very much prefer overcast lighting conditions. It gives me a nice, even light. It's essentially like working under a softbox, a huge softbox that provides even light with relatively low contrast. So for something like this, I found some nice textures in the bark here that I'd like to photograph. That works out pretty well because it means we're not going to have strong relief, too much deep shadows that would really complicate the overall scene. In this case, I'm really thinking about the particular particular patterns here. It's essentially a design element, and so I don't want lots of texture. But even though we have overcast skies, I still have a little bit more shadow than I'd like. There's a little bit too much relief, in my opinion, and so I want some additional light cast on the subject. And for that, I can actually make use of a reflector to reflect some light onto the subject. I'll go ahead and open up my reflector here. And in this case, I'm working with a rather large reflector, and that's going to give me a little bit more capability in terms of getting lots of light on my subject. Now, we need to think about angles a bit when working with a reflector. And for example, looking at where the sun is. Here we've got overcast skies, so it's not very obvious where the sun is, but I want to be aware of the direction the light's coming from, because I'll want to reflect the light from that angle directly onto the subject, in this case, the bark of the tree. And that makes my job a little bit easier, knowing where the light's coming from and where I want to reflect it to. And then I can, of course, see the effect directly on the subject, directly on the tree. But I also need to think about the actual angle that I'm essentially reflecting the light onto the subject. If I come over here, for example, then I'm going to be casting the light across the surface of the bark, and that will actually enhance some of those shadows along the texture of the bark. Instead, I want to come out a little bit further out in front of the subject, behind the camera in this particular situation, so that I'm reflecting light down and straight onto, relatively speaking, the face of that bark, and that will help to fill in those shadows. And since I'm using a gold or partially gold reflector, I'm also going to get a little bit warmer light. So I'll go ahead and get my camera situated here. I'm going to use the live view display so that I can view the subject directly on the LCD display on the back of the camera. I'll then fine-tune my focus. Fortunately, in this case, the subject is not moving at all, a nice sturdy subject, so I don't need to worry much at all about adjusting focus once I have it established. And then using a cable release so that I can work a little more easily, since I'm also holding a reflector, I'll really focus on the subject itself. At this point, I'm going to stop looking at the LCD display. I'm not worried about the live view display anymore. That was just to help me get things set up. Now I'm paying attention just to the subject itself, trying to get the light at just the right angle, coming from just the right direction, so that I'm filling in those shadows. There we go, that looks pretty good. And once I've achieved that, I'll go ahead and press the button on my cable release and take a look at the result, and that looks very, very good. In fact, I'm going to capture an image just for the sake of evaluating the result. I'll capture without that reflector in place, and then looking at the two images, I can see the image without the reflector actually gives me a fair amount of contrast. There's a lot of texture going on there, and I think in this particular case, that's actually not the best result. I'd rather have a little bit less contrast along those textured edges, along the ripples of the bark on this tree. And so I like the result with that reflected light much, much better. And I could certainly use a silver reflector instead of a gold reflector, for example, depending on what I'm trying to accomplish. Do I want some neutral light, or do I want a little bit of a warmer light? But the key thing is to really pay attention to those angles and make sure that you're casting that light in just the right way to improve the appearance of the subject. It doesn't take very long doing macro photography with available light to appreciate that flash can be very, very helpful for macro. It gives us a much stronger light source than we might get with available light, and it also, as a result, helps us achieve greater depth of field. I'm going to set up a flash configuration here. First, I'll get my camera into position, and I have a stamp that I'd like to photograph, so I'll lay that down in front of the camera and get myself configured, and of course mount the flash right on top onto the hot shoe mount. Now this camera actually has a built-in flash, so I could certainly use that, but that's going to put the flash much closer to the lens, and that can create some issues as far as reflection, the light bouncing back into the lens, for example. So using a flash that's mounted onto the hot shoe, getting it a little further from the lens can be very, very helpful. I'll go ahead and get myself composed, focusing on the stamp here. And what I like to do is get myself set up in a very basic way whenever I'm dealing with this type of a situation with a subject on a tabletop, for example. And then I'll use a live view display, or just looking through the viewfinder, I'll go ahead and set myself to an aperture priority mode so that I can see the subject very easily. And then I can move that subject around, and for this particular stamp, it's on a relatively large sheet of paper, but I'm including too much of it at the moment. So I'm going to move it a little bit closer and actually lower the camera here to get a better angle onto the stamp. There, that looks much better. Adjust my focus, at least get a basic focus. I'll fine-tune things here in a moment. And then I can use the live view display once again to just fine-tune the position of the stamp in the frame. That looks to be pretty good right about there. And now I'll go ahead and get my focus, getting the composition totally dialed in before I start to worry about the flash illumination. So focusing at about the front of the more interesting part of the stamp here. And that looks very good. And then I'll go ahead and adjust my exposure. Now actually flash exposure can be very, very easy if you're using a flash with ETTL exposure, because the flash will adjust the power automatically. I'm using a flash that does not have ETTL, it just has TTL, so you can think of that as being essentially a fixed setting. And it's going to make things a little more complicated, but actually it's still very, very easy. I'll switch to my manual exposure mode, and I'm going to use a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second, 125th of a second, which is sort of a standard setting for flash, and it really comes from the issue of needing to have a long enough exposure so that you'll make sure the flash actually fires during that exposure. Some cameras can go much, much faster with flash still firing. And I'm going to start off with an aperture, I think around f/22 will probably work out pretty well. Generally speaking, you could just stop the lens down completely. Now the live view is no longer useful because I'm using a manual exposure, 125th of a second at f/22. That obviously is not going to give me very much light, especially in the context of macro photography. So now if I need to make any adjustments at all, I will need to use the viewfinder, turning off my live view display. And once again, just making sure focus is absolutely perfect. And then I'll go ahead and turn on the flash. So I'm ready to go here. The flash is set up on the camera. My exposure is set. The flash is charged. I'm ready to take a photo. I'll go ahead and plug in my cable release. Of course, I'm using a fast shutter speed, and so the cable release, in terms of the exposure, is really not critical. I'm able to get an adequately fast shutter speed. I'm really not worried about movement, especially considering the stamp is sitting still on a tabletop. But it's still a good idea, generally, to use a cable release. And also, it just makes it a lot more convenient, a lot easier to work, because I can observe everything that's going on and then simply trigger the shutter. And that will fire the flash. And I can see that I'm a little bit overexposed, not a big surprise because I didn't stop the lens down completely. And so I'll adjust my aperture here, going down now to f/32. So I'm going to get even greater depth of field. And we'll fire another shot, and that looks much, much better. So now I've got a good exposure with the supplemental light. Let's consider what would have happened if I wasn't using flash. I'll go ahead and set myself to aperture priority, and once again at f/22, that gives me about a 3/4 of a second exposure. That's a pretty long exposure. I would need to either increase my ISO if I wanted a faster shutter speed, or using that longer exposure, there is a little bit greater risk of noise. And so using the flash is going to give me a greater depth of field without needing to use a long exposure. As you work with flash a little bit more, you'll get more and more confident putting it to use, and actually more creative as well. There's a variety of different things you can do with flash to change the effect for the subject. But at a very basic level, it's simply giving us more light to make macro photography that much easier. Flash can obviously be very helpful for macro photography, helping to illuminate our subject so that we can stop the lens down more for a greater depth of field and also use a faster shutter speed. But it's not without its problems. In particular, flash tends to be a little bit harsh. It gives us a lot of contrast, it's a very strong light, and so we'll want to take measures to try to avoid some of those problems. Also, because we're generally working relatively close to the subject in macro photography, sometimes the angle of the flash can be a little bit problematic. So let's take a look at a few ways that we might work to mitigate the effect of flash in our macro photography. I've already been photographing this particular flower. I have everything set up for a basic shot, but if I shoot this way with just a normal setup with the flash firing directly at the subject, I'm going to end up with a bit of a harsh result. And also, the light is a little bit uneven because the flash is very close to the subject and elevated slightly. I'm getting more light on the top of the flower than I am on the bottom of the flower. One way that I can compensate for this is through the use of a diffuser. Now, a diffuser is a translucent material, so some of the light is coming through, but it's being spread out a little bit more evenly. If I put the diffuser in front of the flash, making sure not to get it into the frame, I can fire that flash, and that will give me a much more even result. Of course, I am blocking some of the light, so I might need to make adjustments to my exposure. I'm going to go ahead and change my exposure. I had it set at f32 at 125th of a second using ISO 100. I'm going to open up the aperture a little bit to f22 instead of f32, and we'll try that again. Again, diffusing some of that light and therefore not getting quite as strong a result. And we'll take a look here, and that looks much, much better. The light is more even across the subject, and that really makes a very big difference. I can also reflect the light a little bit. So I have a reflector here, and I'll go ahead and open this up, and I'm going to use the white side of the reflector in order to bounce the light onto the subject. And this gives me tremendous creative possibilities. In the first case, I'll go ahead and position my reflector over the flash. Now, this might seem a little bit silly. The flash is pointing at the flower, and I have a reflector up above. It wouldn't seem necessarily that this is going to cause much of a change, but actually quite a bit of the light from the flash is spreading out in all directions, including upward, and so now we're going to bounce that light back down onto the flower. So I have everything set up. I'll go ahead and fire. And there we go. We've got a nice illumination of the subject. In many ways, it's very similar to the result I'm getting with the diffuser because that light is being spread out a little more. In the case of the reflector, I'm simply filling in more of those details. But I can also change the direction of the light. The flash will enable me to rotate, for example, over to the side, or I could point it upward if I'd like. I'm going to go ahead and rotate it over to the right-hand side. And then once again, using the reflector, I need to think about the angles here. I'm shooting the flash over to the right-hand side, totally away from the subject, really. There will be some light that still hits the flower, but most of it is being pushed right over to the right-hand side, so I need to position the reflector in such a way that when the light bounces off of the reflector, it will go toward the flower. And what I'm trying to accomplish here is to achieve a little bit of a side lighting type of effect. So once again, making sure that everything is set on the camera. I'm also going to double check my focus, and then I'll hold the reflector over on the right side, and using a cable release to make things a little bit easier, I will go ahead, adjust my angle here, and fire the flash. And now we have a very interesting side lighting effect that I think works out very, very nicely for the subject. It helps to enhance some of the detail in those petals and just gives us a much more interesting result than that head-on flash. So understanding the use of flash obviously is very important, but getting a little bit creative, thinking about possibly using a diffuser or a reflector in order to change the angle of the light to the subject can help you achieve much more interesting results. You can most certainly employ a standard flash for macro photography, but you'll get better results if you employ a flash that is specifically designed for macro photography. That usually takes the form of a ring light, and with a ring light we'll have a flash with a diffuser that mounts on the outside of the lens, projecting light from all the way around that lens, giving us a nice even light for the subject very close to the subject. I'm actually going to use a twin light though. This is similar in concept to a ring light. It is designed specifically for macro photography, but it employs two separate lights that we can adjust independent of each other. I'll go ahead and mount this onto the camera so that we can see how it might be used. In this case, photographing some flowers. I'll get the bracket attached to the front of the lens and the flash unit attached into the hot shoe and get that locked into place. And you can see here that I have articulating arms for the flash heads, and so I can point them inward toward the subject, away from the subject. I can even rotate them around the lens. So for example, with this flower, I could have a flash pointing downward toward the flower and another coming in from the side. I can have one down below. I could put both down below. The point is that I have a lot of flexibility in how I position those flashes, independent of one another. Now, generally speaking, you might assume that I want to point the flashes inward toward the subject, but usually that's going to give us a little bit too harsh a result. And in fact, in most cases, I will point the flashes straight forward. Of course, you might think that's not going to illuminate the subject at all, but remember, the flash is going to send light out in all directions forward of the flash, and so even though the head is pointed forward, we'll still get a good amount of light illuminating the subject. I'm going to capture an image just of the flower here. I've got it already set up. I'll double check my focus here, make sure the camera is set properly. I've stopped the lens down all the way to f/16 so that I can get some good depth of field. And with the flashes pointed straight forward, I'll go ahead using the cable release and fire an image. And that looks pretty interesting. I think I might experiment a little bit with getting some light down underneath, and on the right side I'll point the flash inward a little. I'm actually going to lessen the amount of light that's striking the flower by pointing the flash on the left here outward just a little, and then making sure everything is nice and steady, the flower is not moving at all. I'll go ahead and trigger another capture here. And that also looks interesting. I can also adjust by changing which light is actually firing. And so, for example, I can turn on only the left flash. So the right flash will not fire at all. Only the left flash will. I think in this case I'll have it pointed straight forward, and then I'll trigger the shutter again. And now I have a little bit more light coming in from the left side. To take things a step further, I can also disconnect one of the flashes from the mount and then put it in any position that I'd like. So I could come behind the flower here and project some backlighting onto the flower, so I still have some light coming from the other flash illuminating the front of the subject, but because this is a bit of a translucent flower, I can get a little more light coming through, make that flower look a little more luminous. I'll go ahead and point this flash head right at the flower, coming a little bit from behind, not directly because I don't want to shine light directly into the lens, but reasonably close to that direct angle. And yeah, that looks very interesting. I can also come from the side and maybe at a bit of a distance so that I'll give it some side lighting in addition to the other light. Obviously more light, a stronger light from the left since it's closer, but this light from the right helping to fill in some details and give us some contrast. I could even come back behind a little bit and get some light maybe coming up from a little bit of a higher angle, right about in there. That looks very, very nice. And even coming back behind the camera a bit, but of course I need to be careful not to cast the shadow of my lens right onto the flower. At least usually I need to be careful of that. I might actually be able to produce an interesting result by having part of the subject lit and part of it not. More often than not, it's not going to work very well because we'll get an odd shadow going through the subject, but the idea is that we can try various things, experiment a lot, look at all sorts of different angles, adjust the position and the strength of each of the flashes independently, and come up with some very creative results. There are a lot of technicalities to contend with in macro photography, but I think one of the biggest challenges sometimes is just finding a subject to photograph. We don't tend to look very closely at the world around us. We look at the broad landscape, for example, instead of the small objects contained within. I like to think of a rule of thumb, no pun intended, to look for subjects that are about the size of your thumb and a lot of times even smaller. So for example, here I have some plants. It was raining overnight, so we've got some great droplets of water on the leaves. Granted, this is just a weed, but it still looks pretty nice when you're looking very, very close. And if you look around the landscape, I think you'll find a lot of subjects. There's some tree bark here, for example, and there's some wonderful textures on the tree bark, some nice contrast, and even some really interesting color elements. Wandering around a little bit more, we find more droplets of water, and I think taking a look at lots of different types of plants is great. We've got some weeds over here, some little flowers, some grasses, so paying attention to different types of plants, especially when you're lucky enough to get some water droplets on the plants, that works out very nicely. And of course, we've also got flowers to look at. There's some really nice flowers here. Walking by, you might initially think these flowers are far too small to photograph, but if you look inside the flower, we've got some great yellows and purples in there. You've got to get really, really close. You're going to need a macro lens, but that's the beauty of it, is we can take advantage of subjects that we might otherwise pass over. And speaking of passing over a subject, right beneath my feet here, we've got some possibilities. There's gravel, some rocks on the roadway here, and there are wonderful, beautiful textures, some striations of color. It looks just absolutely wonderful, and you take a closer look and you can get some great photos of subjects such as these. And across the way here, some more subjects to think about. There's a pile of wood, some logs that are set up, and lots of knots and texture, patterns, colors, a lot of different variety, especially when you consider the logs are very large and we're taking a look at a very small subject, and so there are millions of possible framings here, millions of possible photographs. And also over on the side of the road, I've got yet more plants, some flowers, some clover down here, again with water droplets, and even some spider webs. So all sorts of subjects. You just have to take a closer look at what's around you to find the smaller things that you can focus your lens on. I found some nice clover leaves here, and I'm going to get set up and capture some images of the water droplets on the clover leaves. There's no question that macro photography can take a little bit more effort compared to many types of photography. There are a number of special challenges with macro. Depth of field, of course, comes up all the time as a particular challenge with macro photography. And when we're photographing a subject, therefore, because there tends to be a lot of effort involved, there's more of a tendency to just set up once, take your shot, and not worry about it. But really, it can be much more important to think about your angle to the subject and how you're framing up the subject. I realize that it tends to take a lot more time, especially when you're using a tripod. You don't have quite as much flexibility, and frankly, with macro photography, you almost always need to use a tripod so that you can actually get a stable shot. We're going to be working with a little bit slower shutter speeds than we might be accustomed to with other types of photography, and so it really pays to take some time to fine-tune, adjust the position of your tripod, get things situated so that they really look their best. And that's one of the reasons I really love using the live view display on my LCD when capturing macro subjects. It allows me to get a better sense of the subject while I'm working. And so I can use the adjustment on the ball head, for example, to fine-tune the angle and position of the camera relative to the subject, and even moving my tripod around, moving it a little closer to the subject, a little to the side, a little further back, etc., paying attention to the angles, and not just how the subject is being framed, but actually the angle at which I'm looking at the subject. So looking at the subject head on, orthogonal to the plane of the subject. So here I have a flower, for example, and I might want to position the flower in a way so that, in this case, it's a cluster of small flowers. That front flower is essentially a flat plane, and I want that plane to be orthogonal to the line of my lens so that I'm pointing straight at it. I don't want to be pointing at a little bit of an angle. I don't want to be up above it or down below it. I want to be looking it head on, realizing that I might not frame the subject in the center of the frame necessarily, but always wanting to make sure that those angles are at their best. It does take a little bit of extra effort, but it really pays off. In this case, I started off over at the side just a little bit, and it became obvious once I reviewed the images that things were not aligned the way they should be. And so simply moving over to the side just a little bit, taking the camera back just a hair so that we can fine-tune the angles relative to the subject, and that's going to give me a much better result. And of course, then adjusting my camera settings. In this case, I don't need tremendous depth of field for the shot that I have in mind. I want essentially the front flower to be in focus and the others to taper off just a little bit. And so I'm capturing an image at f8, and that gives me a pretty good depth of field. I can use the depth of field preview here just to make sure that that looks, yep, that looks very, very good. So I'll go ahead and use my cable release, wait until the breezes die down, until that flower stops moving just a little bit. And there we go, we've got a capture. And making sure, again, reviewing the image on the LCD to make sure that those angles are optimal for the photograph. It really pays off. We're taking such a close look at our subject with macro photography that the viewer, when they see the image, they're also going to get a very close look. It really pays to pay very close attention to those details. The background of a photograph is always important, but with macro photography that tends to be even more the case. And so it's very important to think about the background whenever you're photographing any subject in macro photography. I found some nice berries here, for example, that I'd like to photograph, and I want to think very carefully about what's behind the berries. And there are a few things to consider in this respect. One is, will there be any other berries behind this berry? And that's going to cause a problem where the berry won't necessarily stand out. The colors are going to blend together. I also don't want a very cluttered background. So photographing from this angle, for example, I have a berry, but behind it are several other berries as well as other stems, and that's going to create a lot of clutter. By contrast, if I come over to this angle, shooting a little bit more head-on, as it were, toward the berry, I can set that berry up against a leaf that will provide a nice, even, continuous background, which will work much, much better for this subject. I also, whenever possible, want to try to have the background be a little bit darker than the subject itself to help that subject stand out a little better. Generally speaking, with macro photography, the background is not very important. With landscape photography, for example, the background provides some context. With macro, it's really more about the subject, and the background is not so critical when it comes to context. So, shooting at this angle, I think, is going to work a little bit better. Shooting the berry right up against the leaf in the background. And so I'm going to set my camera up on the tripod from this angle. And then we'll take a look and fine-tune the composition, trying to make the background as clean and simple as possible. And that looks to be pretty good. I'm actually going to use my live view display so that I can watch both in terms of composition and focus right on the LCD on the back of the camera. So we'll get that set up and then fine-tune my focus. There we go, and I'll check my exposure settings. In this case, I don't want too much depth of field because I still do have some background elements that might form some clutter in the background. So I'm going to shoot at about f11, and that gives me at 1600 ISO, a 20th of a second. I actually don't want to shoot that high in ISO. That's going to give me a little bit too much noise. So I'll take that down to 800 ISO, and at f11, that gives me a 10th of a second, which, being on a stable platform, that'll be all right. I do need to be very, very careful about motion, and as the breeze comes through, that's going to move the berry. So I'm going to want to wait until a moment when the berry is not moving at all, and then I can trigger the shutter using a cable release so that I'm not imparting any motion, any vibration to the camera itself, and ensuring a nice sharp photo of that berry. But of course, the most important thing in this case is having thought about that background, positioning the camera in such a way that I can produce a nice clean background where we have color variations between the subject and its background, where we have good contrast, where hopefully the background itself is darker than the subject and it's not cluttered. So we've got a very nice background, a setting for the subject that we're photographing. I was out buying some flowers to photograph, and I found this very interesting subject. I don't even have any idea what it is. I'll have to look that up later, but it just struck me as being very, very interesting. We've got some nice textures. There's a vein structure going down the front of it, and we've got nice color gradations. The one here that I've chosen to photograph starts off a little bit orange on the top. It transitions through yellow and then all the way down into green. And it just looks very interesting. I've never seen anything like it before. And so I'd like to photograph it. I've been playing around a little bit here, trying to photograph it, trying to come up with something interesting. I've mounted it with my clamp here. You can see that I've clamped the stem and attached the clamp to my tripod leg, so I'm able to position it right in front of the lens. I'm shooting with a 100mm macro lens, and that enables me to get a reasonable distance away, and that is also allowing me to completely fill the frame, so I'm seeing the entire subject, just this one structure. You'll notice that the camera is tilted just a little bit, and that's because I couldn't get this structure, that whatever you call this thing, this little ball, to hang perfectly vertically, and so the stem is at a little bit of an angle. I've had to rotate the camera in order to be able to have it vertical within the frame. As far as the exposure goes, I'm mostly depending upon flash, and so I'm able to stop down the lens pretty significantly, shooting at around f22 at a 125th of a second shutter speed. I'm using a cable release in order to trigger the shutter, and that's because the clamp here, while it helps hold the subject in place, it also is able to move quite a bit. The subject itself could obviously shake quite a bit, and so I don't want to impart any vibration to the camera by pressing the shutter release. And so I'll go ahead and fire a frame here, but I can see very clearly that the lighting is a bit too harsh. I'd like to see a little bit more subtle lighting, and I also think with this subject, especially because of the textures, it'll be very interesting to have the lighting coming a little bit more from the side. Well, I can accomplish that by turning the flash head over to the side, and then using a reflector, I'll go ahead and hold this in place, and essentially bouncing the light off the reflector so that much of the light will be coming from the side of the subject. Go ahead and trigger an exposure there, and that's much better. It's pretty much what I had in mind for this subject. The problem is, while I have the subject filling the frame, I've got some nice lighting coming in from the side, it's a relatively subtle lighting, I've still got some problems, and that is the background. So back behind the subject, I'm shooting with the flash, and even though I'm not pointing the flash directly at the subject, it's bouncing and still illuminating things that are behind the subject. Usually we expect that light fall off to happen pretty quickly, where anything that's a good distance away from the subject won't be illuminated at all. But here we're still getting enough light that some of the clutter that I have in the background is being shown in the background of the photo. That's a little bit problematic. Well, I can fix that relatively easily using a black cloth. I just want to make sure that it's not a shiny reflective cloth that's going to put light back into the camera, but I can hold this behind the subject, helping to make sure that I get a pure black background. Of course, that might require 3 hands in this case, because I need to hold the shirt, I need to hold the reflector, and I also need to trigger the shutter, and I've been using a cable release for that. Well, this is a good situation where I can use the timer mode. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my mode, my exposure mode here, to timer. We'll use a 10-second timer so that I have enough time to get set up. So I'll go ahead and grab my cloth. I'm going to pinch it under my arm and hold with my other hand, and then I'll make sure that I'm ready with my reflector, and I'll trigger the shutter. So now I've got 10 seconds to get into position, and holding the black cloth behind and the reflector in the right position. And there's the exposure. All right, so let's take a look at what we've got. We'll review the image on the LCD, and that looks great. So now I have a subject that's well lit, the light coming from the side, but the background is pure black. There's no distracting texture back there at all. Very often we can use just the flash, making sure that there's nothing too close to the background of the subject, but if that doesn't work out, we can also use a black cloth. Of course, keep in mind, if we can get the subject above the horizon or away from any of the clutter that's in the background, that might work as well. But getting a little bit creative, we can achieve a background that doesn't have any clutter that'll distract from the main subject. Generally speaking, sharpness is the name of the game in macro photography, and that means both acquiring good focus and also achieving reasonably good depth of field for the subject. But sometimes I like to play around a little bit and actually intentionally blur the subject, even at a macro level. Usually that translates into design elements, abstract textures and shapes and colors that just get blended into various patterns, various shapes because of a blur in some form or another. In this particular situation, I've found the nice dandelion, and I'm using a clamp attached to my tripod in order to mount that dandelion right in front of the lens. I'm using a 1x to 5x, so I'm getting very, very close. In this particular situation, getting about 3x, so quite close, quite magnified for the particular subject. In this case, the dandelion is made of these feathery objects, and I really only have about 2 or 3 of them visible in the viewfinder. So that's going to give me a very abstract design. Then the question is, how am I going to go about blurring it? Well, first off, I need to make sure that I'm getting a relatively slow shutter speed. Usually we're trying to do exactly the opposite with macro, but when we're trying to achieve a blur, we're going to need some level of movement, so we want a reasonably slow shutter speed, and that can mean anything around 1/8 of a second to 1/4 of a second, even up to a second and beyond, depending on how much motion you're going to use and how fast that motion is going to occur. I'm going to start off with a rotational blur, and I'm using a lens that has a collar mount, and that makes it very, very easy to rotate the camera. I can simply loosen up that collar and then rotate the camera relative to the subject, but maintaining the same distance, so I'll have the exact same overall composition, the same focus, etc. I'm going to go ahead and make sure, first of all, I'll tighten up that collar. I'll use my live view here, make sure that the composition looks good, that I have my shapes and textures and patterns positioned the way I'd like them. And I'll also make sure that I've achieved critical focus. I'm using a focusing rail for that purpose here. And that looks very good. I'll check my exposure. I'm going to bring my ISO down, and in fact all the way down to ISO 100 in this particular case, and I can open up the lens quite a bit. I don't need a lot of depth of field. I just want to make sure that the key subjects, the key shapes, are reasonably sharp. So I'll go ahead and open up the lens all the way, in this case to f2.8, and that gives me about a 1 second exposure at ISO 100. I'll loosen up that collar once again and move the camera over into a position about a 45-degree angle in this case. I'm going to use one hand to move the camera and the other hand to trigger the shutter release via my cable release so that I don't jiggle the camera by pressing the shutter button on the camera itself. So just holding the camera nice and steady and then starting the motion before I trigger the shutter and then moving through, and I've got 1 second to make that full motion, and that gives me a very abstract blur effect. Lots of fun. I think it might actually be interesting to get a little bit less time for that exposure, so I'm going to bring my ISO up. I'll take it all the way up to 800 actually. That'll give me an 1/8 of a second exposure, and we'll try that one more time. Again, the same basic position, same basic technique, using a cable release to trigger the shutter, but first starting the motion of the camera, this time moving a bit faster because I don't have quite as much time, just an 1/8 of a second as opposed to a full second. I can also try a variety of other methods of motion. I'm going to go ahead and lock down the camera again, tighten up that collar around the lens. And one of the things that I can do is adjust the zoom setting or the focusing position, so I could use my focusing rail, or in this particular case with the 1x to 5x I have in effect a zoom setting. It's sort of more like a focusing setting really, but we can use that as the basis. So I'll use one hand to adjust the lens itself and the other to trigger the shutter release. So again, starting that motion a little bit, in this case after I've triggered the shutter. So I start off with a sharp capture and then I'm blending into the blurred capture. So I'll trigger and move in one fluid motion, and that gives me a little bit of a subtle blur. And I can also, I'll go ahead and reacquire my original setup here, my original configuration, nice sharp appearance for the image, and I can move the dandelion, the subject, just by wiggling that clamp and releasing. That'll give me a nice shaking motion, so I could push it to move side to side, I can push it to move forward and aft, trying different variations, different methods of moving that subject, even holding the clamp so that I can, for example, turn a little bit in a circle and then trigger the exposure. All of these are going to give me different design elements, very, very abstract images, all by taking a macro photo and imparting it with a little bit of motion to make it even more abstract than it already would have been. I found some very nice flowers here, and in particular I'm interested in these purple flowers. They've got a really nice depth to them. The petals themselves have some striations on them, some stripes essentially, and then the interior structure of the flower comes out relatively far, so it's a bit of a deep flower, especially in the context of macro photography where we're concerned about depth of field. We're generally going to be working with a very narrow depth of field. And it's very common with macro photography that we would be trying to do everything we possibly could in order to increase the depth of field. For example, here, trying to get both the interior elements of the flower as well as the petals in the background to be in sharp focus. But sometimes I actually like to work against that effort. I prefer to try and achieve a relatively narrow depth of field. I'm not concerned about getting everything in focus. In the case of this flower, what I'm essentially deciding is that the interior elements of the flower are the subject, and that the petals in the background are really just a background element. They're just a backdrop for the interior of the flower. So I'm not really thinking of the overall flower as the subject, but rather a part of the flower. And in the context of macro photography, because I'm taking such a close look at the flower, it really translates into a design element. At first glance, you're not even necessarily going to know exactly what you're looking at. It's just shapes and colors and textures. And to me, that actually makes the photograph more interesting. So I've set up my camera here. I'm trained on one flower in particular. I'm fortunate that that particular flower happens to be in the shade, so I have a nice even lighting over the flower. I'm using a very high magnification macro lens. This is a 65mm 1x to 5x lens, and so I'm able to get very, very close and magnify that flower, get nice and close and create a tight composition. Because I'm using this lens, it's really important that I'm working with a focusing rail. Otherwise, it would be darn near impossible to get accurate focus on this subject. So I've gotten myself all configured using a ball head to help position the camera appropriately, using that focusing rail to get crisp focus, and I'm going to take a look at my camera settings. Now, there's a bit of a breeze here. I could certainly try to tone things down by blocking the wind. I'm in a relatively protected space though, so it's not too bad. I just have to make sure to wait in between the motion of the breeze before I trigger the shutter. And looking at the image, I've got my live view turned on so that I can see the image on the LCD display. I might be tempted, as I mentioned a moment ago, to stop down that lens, to take it down to f/16, f/22, maybe even f/32, depending on the capabilities of your lens, and try to get as much in focus as possible. But I'm actually going to shoot this wide open. I'm going to take the lens all the way to f2.8. I've had to increase the ISO setting. I've gone up to ISO 400 here, and that's giving me a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. And that should be more than adequate to stop whatever minor motion there might be in the flower as I'm shooting. So I'll fine-tune my focus here. Again, focusing on the interior elements of the flower itself, not worrying about the petals in the background. Once I've got the focusing rail set up to the proper position, I'll go ahead and lock it in so it doesn't move inadvertently. And now I'm all set. I'll go ahead and capture an exposure here. There we go, stopping again, waiting between the motion of the breeze, making sure that I've got as little motion as possible. I'm using a reasonably fast shutter speed, but still that motion can be a problem. I'm going to take a look at the histogram, and it looks like I have a little bit of room. The blue channel is very, very bright. Of course, the flowers are purple. That's in the range of blue. But I think I could get away with just a little bit brighter exposure. So I'm going to add a +1 stop exposure compensation, essentially. So now I'm shooting at f2.8 and a shutter speed of 1/80th of a second. And again, waiting for the breeze to stop, waiting for the motion of the flower to subside, and using the cable release to trigger the shutter. And there we go. That looks very, very nice. So again, reviewing the result on the LCD, getting a good look, and I can see very clearly here I have the interior portions of the flower are in nice focus, and the background is just an interesting backdrop of textures and colors. We've got the striations, the lines on the petals that form some interesting shapes moving outward, and so I think that is actually a very interesting photograph. It's not what you would typically try to accomplish with a macro subject. Again, usually you're trying to get as much depth of field as you possibly can, but sometimes going against that conventional wisdom can help you produce a more interesting final result. Macro photography is all about taking a closer look at the world around us. We might have a tendency to see overall objects, to take a very broad view of the world. In this particular instance, maybe seeing this object as a flower. But with macro photography, especially when we get past the 1x value, when we're really taking a close look at a subject, this flower no longer is a flower. It's really a collection of shapes, textures, colors. It becomes a much more abstract subject that we're photographing. And that's actually part of the fun of macro photography, and also part of what makes it such a creative form of photography. I'd like to photograph these flowers looking for some interesting design elements, so I'll move the flowers underneath my setup. I already have my camera set up on a tripod with a focusing rail, my twin light flash, and so I'm ready to just get everything configured. I'll get the flower into position here, and what I'm really doing initially is trying to find an interesting element, interesting shapes, a collection of shapes. The way I typically work is to first position the flower below the lens in this case, since I'm pointed downward, and then adjust the position. I'll loosen up my ball head and also loosen up my focusing rail so that I can move the camera around freely. I'll then also turn on my live view. I'm going to set the exposure mode to aperture priority so that I can see an exposure simulation. And I'll use the vertical adjustment, moving the camera closer to the subject or further away so that I can adjust focus essentially, and then move the camera just looking for interesting shapes. When I find an interesting shape, of course, I'll lock down the position of the camera. I'll tighten up that ball head and then also use the focusing rail to just fine-tune the focus in the camera here. And that looks to be very good. And I think initially in this case I'm going to point the flashes directly forward. I'll use a cable release here so that I don't cause any movement of the camera. I've got my exposure set. I'll switch back to manual mode. 16 is my aperture, f16, and a 2/50th of a second for the shutter speed. And I'll trigger that shot. And that's looking very interesting. I think I'm going to need a little more light from the left side and maybe a little less on the right side, and we'll try that again. Let the flash charge, and trigger the shutter release. And again, seeing some very interesting textures. I've got these overlapping arches that look very, very interesting, almost like a cave with color beaming out from it. And I can adjust the position of the flashes and maybe take some light up to the top here, put both of the lights up at the top and point them both downward, essentially going straight once again. And we'll trigger that. Ooh, even more interesting because we've got some light coming in from the top. So I'll go ahead and switch the camera to the manual exposure mode and use the cable release to trigger the shutter. And that looks very, very nice. And again, I can continue refining my flash setup, moving the flashes around, changing the angle at which the flashes are firing, and all the while just looking for interesting ways to interpret this subject. I have two flowers here, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to the other flower. This one's a little bit lighter, and I think it's going to make a more interesting subject in terms of that flash really illuminating. I think I'm going to want a lot of side lighting for this particular flower. So adjusting the focus, getting everything configured just right. I'll go ahead and now tighten up the focusing rail and switch back into my manual exposure mode. And I'll use again the shutter release. And that looks very nice. I think I'll go ahead and remove the lights now. I'd like to get some side lighting in this particular case, so I'm going to remove both of the flash heads from the twin light here. And cable release in one hand and both of the flashes now. And I'll just point them at the side of the flower, trying to get a nice side lighting effect and keeping the flashes relatively far away. I don't want the light to be too harsh, and we'll see how that turns out. Oh, that looks very, very nice. So I'm going to continue experimenting around, moving the position of the flower and then adjusting the position of the camera as needed, fine-tuning the focus and the degree of magnification, and then using my lights to adjust that lighting to find exactly the way I'd like to light each individual area. And each of these individual images, each portion of the flowers in this particular case, is a whole new design element. It's a whole new abstract image. And so I can really experiment around. There's millions of photographic possibilities in this one small subject because I'm taking such a close look at the form, the shape, the textures, the colors that make this subject into the flower that it is, but now the photograph no longer resembles anything near a flower. Flowers are among the more popular subjects for macro photography, and with good reason. They offer great colors, shapes, patterns, textures. They seem perfectly suited to macro photography. And one of the ways that photographers often like to capture photographs of flowers when working macro is with water droplets on the petals. You might be lucky enough to find flowers out in the wild that have been made wet by the rainfall, or in a garden that have been made wet with sprinklers. And if that's not the case, you can always make the flowers wet yourself. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here in the studio. I've got a mister bottle that I could use to spray some water onto the flower, but I've actually also got a perfume bottle that I've filled with water instead of perfume, and I found that this works especially well for spreading an even droplet pattern over the flower petals. So I'll use that, but first I'm going to put the flower into my clamp and get all set up, ready to photograph it. The stem is a bit long on this flower, so I'm going to start off by shortening that stem. And then I'll clamp the flower into place right in front of the camera and adjust it so that it's pointed right at the lens of the camera, as close to being perfectly straight as possible. And once I've got the flower set up, I can get behind the camera here and make sure that I have the flower in sharp focus and adjust my exposure settings. I'm going to be using a flash here to illuminate the subject. And so I'll stop the lens down. I'm actually going to go all the way down to f32 and shoot at a 2/50th of a second shutter speed. And I can also adjust my ISO, in this case probably all the way down to 100. I'll go ahead and adjust the flash. I think in this case I'm going to bounce the flash, but that takes care of it as far as the camera settings are concerned. So I'm ready to mist my flower here. So I'll go ahead and get close in, making sure that I'm not spraying the camera or the front of the lens by accident. And I'll just mist the petals of the flower. That looks great. And then get set up, double check my focus, of course. And I'm going to bounce the flash. So I'll hold a reflector up near the flash. I think in this case I'll angle it down just a little bit. I have the flash pointing upward just a little bit, and so using a cable release, making sure that there's no motion in the flower, I'll go ahead and trigger the capture, and that looks very nice. So I've got the water droplets illuminated by the flash, and it just makes the subject look that much more interesting. And it's very, very easy to do, of course. Just spray a little bit of water onto those petals, and otherwise it's just a normal macro photograph. I have some coins that I'd like to photograph here. I've spread them out in just a loose assortment, some of them stacked upon each other, but basically just spread out a little bit randomly on the table. And I'm going to photograph them at a relatively low angle, looking across the tops of the coins. That means that I'm going to have to consider depth of field. I'll have some coins that are relatively close to the lens and some coins that are a bit further away from the lens. And of course, with macro photography, depth of field is a serious consideration. I'll probably want to think about stopping the lens down, for example, in order to achieve good depth of field. Let's take a look at what might be possible in this particular situation. I'll go ahead and first set up the camera. I've got it set up on the tripod here, aimed at about where I want it. I've taken a rough look here in terms of the composition. In this particular type of situation, I actually do want to think about leveling the horizon. With macro photography, of course, we don't tend to have a horizon in view, but here the coins are laying on a flat, level surface, and so I'd like to make sure that the camera is also perfectly level. I have a level built into the camera itself, and so I can adjust the position of the camera to make sure that it's perfectly level. You could also use a bubble level mounted into the hot shoe, for example, but since I have this feature on my camera, I can make the adjustment here. That looks great. And so now that I'm all set up, I can start to think about the exposure. At the moment, I'm set at an aperture of f8. I could stop the lens down. I'm going to go ahead and stop the lens down to its minimum sized aperture. That happens to be f32 for this lens. That's a very small diameter aperture. It means I'm going to get lots of depth of field. And if you've done any landscape photography, you can imagine, of course, a tremendous amount of depth of field with a lens stopped down to f32. For macro, that's simply not the case. I'll go ahead, in fact, I'm going to turn on my live view, adjust my focus for a subject that's relatively close to the front of the frame, and then I'll use a cable release so that I don't cause any shaking of the camera as I trigger the shutter, and I'll capture an image, and I will wait, and now I get my exposure. That's about a 2-second exposure with these settings. And that's a little bit problematic because there could be some motion. Obviously, my camera is very stable, the coins are stable on the table, but you could still get some degree of vibration with that longer exposure. So it could certainly be problematic with a 2 or 4-second exposure. And also, if we review the image itself, I have pretty good depth of field, but it's not completely front to back in the frame. The coins in the front are very, very sharp, but as we get further back in the frame, they start to become a little bit less sharp. So even stopped down to f32, I'm not able to achieve full depth of field for this subject. Well, considering that I'm worried about the exposure, the time of the exposure, and I'm not able to achieve a full depth of field at f32 anyway, I could start to think about composite depth of field. Capturing multiple images where I have relatively narrow depth of field, but I capture, for example, one coin fully in focus and then the next coin behind it fully in focus and the next coin and so on, so that all of the coins appear in full focus. I'll adjust my exposure settings. I'm going to take the aperture down to a setting of 8, f8, and with that I get an exposure here using ISO 400 of 1/4 of a second, and that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. And 2-second, 4-second exposure is starting to get a little bit long even with a stable platform because there are certainly other things that could go wrong. And also with a composite situation, if I'm capturing multiple images, that just compounds the situation because now I have an even longer total time frame that I'm capturing the subject, hoping that none of those coins get knocked off the table, for example. I'll go ahead and adjust my focus now toward the front, and on the live view display I'm seeing a very, very narrow depth of field. But it's important to keep in mind that this live view display by default is based on a wide open aperture, f2.8 for this lens. I could use my depth of field preview to get a better sense of the depth of field, but I actually, when I'm capturing a composite depth of field scenario, I actually operate assuming the narrowest depth of field just so that I have even more overlap between the areas that are in focus. And so I'm going to work at f8, but essentially capture the multiple images as though I were using f2.8. And what I like to do when I'm adjusting that focus is to actually pull the focus toward the front. I start at the front and work my way back, and I also will set the focus a little bit in front of the subject, just as insurance to make sure that I truly have the full range of my subject, of the framing, in sharp focus, at least in one of the frames that I'm capturing. I'm using manual exposure mode, by the way, so that I don't need to worry about the exposure changing as I adjust my focus. That really shouldn't be an issue, considering it's the same subject framed up exactly the same way, but that just removes that as a variable, one less thing for me to concern myself with. So fine-tuning the focus, I'll then use my shutter release via the cable release here, and I will capture that first image, and then I will adjust my focus, so moving that focus essentially a little bit further back in the frame, making sure that I'm overlapping. And once again, I'm using the narrowest depth of field on my preview. My actual photos are going to have a greater depth of field, so I'm really making sure that I'm going to have the best results possible in the final image. So taking the next image and then adjusting the focus once again, capture the next image, and just adjusting focus in very small increments, watching the detail in the subject, in the individual coins here, to make sure that I'm capturing each section of each coin in sharp focus. And that can take a fair number of photos. I would guess in this particular situation, it will probably end up as around about a dozen photos or so, but then I can bring those images together after the fact using Photoshop or a variety of other tools in order to create a final composite image where everything is in focus, where I've got a tremendous depth of field relative to what otherwise might be possible. As I capture these images, by the way, I'm noticing that I am getting some blown out highlights, but these are shiny objects. The coins obviously are reflecting the light. I've illuminated the subject a little bit here with some additional lights, and so I don't mind those specular highlights at all. We expect that shiny objects that are lit up will have some degree of reflection, some degree of blown out areas of specular highlight, and I think that's perfectly fine. So I'm not in the least bit worried about that. I'm more interested in the fine detail on the coins themselves. Now, coming to the farthest reaches of the coins that are actually in the frame, I will continue to move my focus all the way outside the frame. Just as I started before I got to the frame, I'm going to finish outside of the frame at the top as well. And I think that takes care of it. I could also capture an image in the beginning and the end of my hand in manual exposure, for example, to mark those images. Generally speaking, with this type of configuration, it's going to be pretty obvious. You'll be able to see where the focus begins and ends, but that's another nice little trick to help make sure you know which images are part of this particular group. So taking care to overlap each of the exposures in terms of that narrow depth of field, I'll now be able to take all of my images and assemble them into a composite where I have full depth of field for the entire image. In macro photography, we're constantly dealing with the issue of depth of field, specifically not having enough depth of field. I captured this image of coins at an aperture of f8, and as photographers we tend to think of f8 as an aperture that will give us a pretty good amount of depth of field. And yet because I was so close to the subject here, the depth of field is a fraction of an inch. We can deal with that by capturing multiple images and then bringing them together into a composite, where the sharp portion of each image is blended together to create a final result that's completely sharp. You can see here, for example, the focus is at about the front of the group of coins, and as I go through the images, you'll see that the focus moves its way back toward the back coins in the photo, and so I can take all of these images and blend them together to extend depth of field in the final result. I'll go ahead and choose Edit, Select All from the menu to select all of the images here. I've already created a folder that contains only the images that I want to work with. I could just as easily click on the first image and then shift-click on the last image in the set in order to select all of the images that I want to assemble. I'll then choose Tools, Photoshop, and then Load Files into Photoshop Layers from the menu. When I do so, these images will be sent to Photoshop and all of them will be assembled into a single layered document. With that process complete, you can see that I now have a document that consists of 20 layers. All of my original images have been stacked together into a single image. Of course, I can only see the topmost image at the moment because there are no layer masks to determine which portions of an image will be revealed, but that's all going to change in a moment. The first thing I want to do now that I have my layers assembled in Photoshop is make sure they're all properly aligned. They should be very well aligned since I captured these images from a tripod and the only thing that changed from frame to frame was the focus, but I just want to be doubly sure. So I'll click on the first image at the top of the Layers panel and then scroll down to the bottom of the Layers panel and hold the Shift key and click on the last layer. I can then go to the menu and choose Edit, Auto Align Layers, and then I'll leave the projection option set to auto and simply click the OK button, and Photoshop will go about the task of aligning these images based on the actual content within the photos. Once the images are aligned, it's time to blend them so that I can expand my depth of field, my depth of focus here. So I'll go ahead and choose Edit, and then Auto Blend Layers in order to bring up the Auto Blend Layers dialog. I'll choose Stack Images. The other option is to choose Panorama, which is obviously not the type of image I'm creating in this particular case. And I want to turn on the Seamless Tones and Colors checkbox to make sure that the images will blend as smoothly as possible. I'll go ahead and click OK, and Photoshop will get to work blending the images together, creating layer masks in the process so that I have a final composite image which will hopefully represent complete focus from front to back all the way throughout the frame. You can immediately see that the depth of field has been greatly expanded, but you might also notice some artifacts in the image, some areas that are not in focus, and these are actually a result of the Auto Align option. Usually this will actually help improve the result, but in this case it created some problems for us. In concept, Auto Align can be very helpful. For example, it can help you blend images even if they were handheld, although I certainly wouldn't recommend that for macro photography. I'm going to reassemble this composite image without using the Auto Align option, but then we'll come back and see how we could even fix this image if we needed to. I'll go ahead and switch to Bridge. I still have all of the images selected, and so I'll choose Tools, Photoshop, and then Load Files into Photoshop Layers one more time. This will create an additional document that I can use to demonstrate the process without the Auto Align option. Now that the new document has been created with all of my layers stacked together, I'll go ahead and click on the first layer and then shift-click on the last layer in order to select all of the layers, and then I'll choose from the Edit menu not the Auto Align Layers option, but just the Auto Blend Layers option. I'll choose the Stack Images method and make sure that Seamless Tones and Colors is turned on, and then I'll click OK so that Photoshop can blend the images together. Again, this time without using the Auto Align option. As you can see, with this set of images, the results are much better without using the Auto Align option. But let's go back to the image that was created with the Auto Align option and take a look at how we might fix this if we wanted to. You'll notice that I have multiple layers with multiple layer masks. Those layer masks are defining which portion of each image layer is actually going to be visible in our composite. We'll take a look at the bottom left corner here, for example. I'll zoom in a little bit so that we can see some of the artifacts there. And what's really happening is a layer that is not sharp is being revealed instead of a layer that is sharp. The layer that is sharp here happens to be the third image, so I'm going to hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while clicking on the eye icon for that layer so that we can reveal the sharp image. And then I'll turn on the visibility of the image above and the image above that, and we'll find our culprit. This is the area that is blurry on one photo, and it's blocking the sharp portion of another photo. The first thing we need to do is reveal the sharp portion that's underneath, so I'll go back to only my third layer here, and I'm going to click on the layer mask, and then choose the brush tool, and make sure that I'm painting with white, so I can set the colors to their default values. I can press the letter D on the keyboard for those defaults, and I'm going to paint with white in order to reveal this layer. Keep in mind that I'm painting on the layer mask, not on the image layer. It's not a bad idea to click on the thumbnail for the layer mask itself, just to make sure that you're painting in the right place. And then I'll go ahead and paint with white in order to reveal that sharp portion of the image, and you can see the coin looks great in that particular area. But I'll go ahead now and reveal the layers above, and in particular we'll focus on this area, the larger area here that's out of focus, and that is on the topmost layer, our first layer. And so that blurry area of the first layer is blocking that sharp area in the image that's a couple layers below. And so I now need to block this layer in order to reveal the sharp image that is below. I'll go ahead and click on the layer mask, and still using the brush tool, I can press the letter X on the keyboard to exchange the foreground and background colors so that now black is my foreground color, and painting with black on the layer mask, I will block the blurry area of this layer. So you can see that I revealed the sharp version of this area of the coin based on the third layer, and then I blocked the blurry area with the first layer. I could continue in this fashion, working on multiple layers in order to blend together all of the images to create a seamless composite. But of course it's much easier to let Photoshop do the work for me, so in this particular case it was actually better to not perform the auto align step. In most cases, I would say that you do want to perform the auto align step, but as you've seen with this example, that's not always the case, and so it's important to evaluate the results to make sure you're getting exactly what you're looking for. And even when things look great, it's good to examine the image a little bit more closely, looking for artifacts and blemishes so that you can make those corrections on the layer masks as needed. But as you've seen, with the use of the auto align and auto blend features in Photoshop, we can create an image with extended depth of field even when faced with the challenge of very narrow depth of field in macro photography. Photoshop provides you with the ability to blend multiple images to extend depth of field in macro photography, but sometimes you might find that it doesn't produce the very best results. In those situations, I'll employ Helicon Focus to assemble my extended depth of field images with great results. I'll go ahead and add images to the project here. I have a set of images photographed of coins, and so I'll click on the first image in the bunch, and then shift-click on the last image and click Open. Those images will then be assembled as the source images. You can scroll through and see all of the images are here, 1 through 20, and those are the images that I'm going to blend together in order to create the final result. And as you'll see in a moment, the process is really quite simple. All I really need to do is make sure that the render method is set to method B, the depth map, and then I can fine-tune the radius and smoothing settings if I'd like. The radius setting determines how far out from each pixel Helicon Focus will evaluate in order to determine if an image is in focus. For images with very fine detail, a relatively low setting is best, and for images that don't have a lot of fine detail, a higher setting is best. This image is sort of somewhere in between, but there is a fair amount of fine detail, so I'm going to lower the radius setting just a little bit. I think about 6 or 7 should work out just fine. The smoothing option allows you to adjust the degree of blending within the images. A lower setting will give you a sharper result, but you might see some artifacts. A higher setting will make sure you don't see artifacts, but the overall image won't look quite as sharp. I generally leave this set at the default value of 4, but you might want to fine-tune this in certain situations if you find that 4 is not giving you the best results. That's all I need to do in order to begin the process of blending these images together, and so I'll go ahead and click the Render button at the top right of the dialog here, and then Helicon Focus will set about the task of assembling my composite image. During that process, you'll be able to see the masking that's going on. You'll see where it's blending the images, defining which portions of each image are in focus. That will appear just as gray shaded areas on the display. And that's just one of the indications that Helicon Focus is actually processing the image, getting ready to prepare an extended depth of field final result. Once Helicon Focus is finished processing the images, the results are quite impressive. We have a nice sharp photo all the way from top to bottom, front to back, left to right. Everywhere in the image appears to be in tack sharp focus, which is a great result, especially for a macro subject where achieving good depth of field can be a real challenge. So I'll go ahead and choose File, Save Image from the menu. That will bring up the Save dialog. I can type a name for this image. I'll go ahead and call this Extended DOF for depth of field, and I'll save it in the same location where the source images are contained. I'll choose a file format. In this case, I'll just use the TIFF file format. I could also use the Photoshop PSD file format, but most of these other file formats I would probably not use. I want to keep the master image in a high-quality image format with no image compression. I will, however, use LZW compression, which is a lossless compression that will help reduce the size of the TIFF file. I'll go ahead and click Save, and my result is saved. As you've seen in this lesson, Helicon Focus makes it remarkably easy to produce a high-quality extended depth of field image, helping us to achieve depth of field that you might have never thought possible in macro photography. We've got some great roses here that I'd like to photograph. Very often when you find flowers, you might be tempted to spray with a mister bottle and get some water droplets onto the roses or flowers, and it can be a very, very nice effect. In this case, though, actually, the sprinklers were on this morning, and so the roses that are still mostly in the shade still have some of those water droplets. And I found one rose in particular here that looks very, very nice with the water droplets sitting on top of the petals curved very nicely and overlapping with each other. And so I think this area right in here makes for a very nice photograph. So I'm going to get set up here and see what I can come up with in terms of an interesting photograph of this rose. I'll go ahead and get my tripod set up here first. And needing to get reasonably close, I'm working with a 100mm macro lens, and so I don't need to get terribly close, but I certainly want to be able to get a little bit close to the subject here. And right about there is probably going to work out pretty well. Go ahead and adjust focus just to get a sense. And usually one of my first steps as I'm getting things set up is to try to get the focus reasonably close to being established so that as I'm continuing to fine-tune the position of the camera, etc., then I have a good idea of what, in this case, the rose is going to look like. And so I'll go ahead and get the position of the camera fine-tuned. I'm really just keying in on a couple of key petals that have most of the water droplets still intact. A couple of petals here have gotten to be mostly dry, but there's a couple of nice ones here that really look very, very nice. And so I think I have the position set up pretty well. Now, even though there's not really any breeze, if you were standing here, you would say there's no breeze at all. The flower doesn't seem to be moving, and yet if you look closely, it is actually moving just a tiny little bit. And considering that with macro photography, I'm going to need to probably stop down the lens a fair amount, I'm going to be using a relatively slow shutter speed. Even that small amount of motion can be problematic. So I'm going to actually constrain the movement of the rose a little bit using my clamp. This is just a simple clamp that I can use to attach very gently to the stem of the rose. I'll first attach one end to the tripod, and then going right underneath the rose, I will attach it very gently, and attaching it very close to the base of the rose itself so that it's helping to stop the movement of the rose. If I attach it too far down the stem, it's still giving me a lot of possibility for motion up on the stem, further up closer to the flower. Of course, now I'm going to need to recompose and get things lined up, once again adjusting the focus as needed. And that looks to be a pretty good composition. I'm happy with that setup as it's coming. Now I'm also going to then adjust my exposure settings. I'm going to go ahead and turn on live view just because it makes it a little bit easier to work. And I'll go ahead and check my aperture here. I'm going to stop down. I'm going to use my depth of field preview to get a sense. I'm starting off at about f8, and that looks like not quite enough depth of field, because while the rose is not exactly huge, I do have some layers here, and so the petals that are down underneath are rendered out of focus relative to the petals that are higher up, and even some of the water droplets that are further down on some of the petals might be out of focus. So I'm going to stop down actually all the way to f22, and that looks to be much better. Again, using the depth of field preview, evaluating the image on my LCD display, I think f22 is going to work out pretty well. So I'll use that as the basis. Now at this point, I'm working at an ISO setting of 100, and that's giving me a 1/4 of a second shutter speed. That's very, very slow. Even though I've stabilized the flower, there's the chance of a little bit of subtle motion, and so I'd like to speed up that shutter speed a little. I'll take my ISO setting up to 400, and that's a comfortable setting. Going higher, I would feel that there's a little bit too high a risk of noise. This is giving me a 1/15 of a second, which, considering I've stabilized things pretty well, I think that's going to work just fine as far as my shutter speed. Now, because I've got my clamp attached to the tripod, any touching of the camera at all is going to give some vibration through that clamp into the rose, and it's going to cause a little bit of motion. And so in order to minimize that, I also want to use a cable release. And so I'll grab my cable release out of the bag here and attach it to the camera, connecting it there. And so now, once I have everything set up, I can just sit back, look at the LCD, wait for a moment when there seems to be no motion in the rose at all, and then trigger the shutter using that cable release. I also am seeing that I'm getting a little bit of mixed light on the flower, on the rose here. And in fact, now I'm getting a little bit of sun coming from behind me, and it's actually casting a shadow of the camera onto part of the rose. So obviously that's a little bit of a problem. Normally I would use a reflector for that purpose, or a diffuser. In this case, especially shooting macro, I don't actually even need to take it out of the container, out of the bag here. It's large enough, because the subject is relatively small, my field of view is relatively small, that just using it still inside its container is going to be just fine as far as blocking the light from that particular portion of the subject. And so I'll get myself set up. I want to once again check my focus. Make sure that we are focused, and generally speaking, focusing on the closest area of the subject that I consider to be critical. And then the depth of field will continue beyond that. That looks to be pretty good. Check those settings, and then blocking with one hand, making sure that the light is very, very even on the rose, and then using the cable release, I can capture an image there. And that looks to be a good result, except that I think we're actually ending up with a little bit too dark an exposure. Because the subject is relatively even, we're ending up with an exposure that's a little bit dark. It's essentially trying to make the entire flower middle gray, and there are areas that should be rendered a little bit brighter. And in fact, I think I can get away with about a full stop, a +1 stop of exposure compensation. So I'll dial that in, and then again, blocking the light, making sure it looks even. I'll turn on my live view display so I can get a better sense of the subject and how it's composed. That looks very good. So once again, just waiting until there's no motion, no apparent motion in the subject. And that looks very, very nice. Much better exposure. So taking a variety of pieces, using a cable release, using a clamp to stabilize the subject, using a reflector but still inside of its bag to block the light, giving me a nice even light over the subject, and thinking carefully about my exposure settings, I'm able to put all these pieces together and come away with a very nice photo. Last night it rained a bit, and that's given all of the foliage here a nice dusting of water droplets, which looks absolutely wonderful. I've been exploring around looking for interesting subjects to photograph with the water droplets, but I've found a lot of spider webs as well. And here with this wood pile, there are quite a few spider webs. I found one in particular that's in a good open space, so I'm going to try and set up and see if I can get a great shot of the spider web with the water droplets on it. Of course, one of the challenges here is that I don't want to disturb the spider web. It's obviously very fragile, and so I need to be very careful where I move. The spider web is attached up on this log, and then it continues down into the foliage down here, so I just want to move about very, very carefully. Of course, I want to get my tripod set up, and so I'll be very careful doing that. I'm going to get the legs spread out over here, and then I'll move it into position, and watching those legs as I lower it down into the foliage to make sure that I don't touch the spider web and that I don't touch the foliage that it's attached to. Now, one of the challenges in this particular position, there's so much foliage that things are pretty soft. I don't have a very stable platform, and underneath the foliage, it's also a little bit of soft mud, and so I'm going to push the tripod down into the ground a little bit to try to get it as stable as possible. And then I'll get the camera mounted on the ball head, And at this point too, one of the things to keep in mind with macro photography, we're working very close to the subject, and if the lens touches that spider web, it's going to damage it, ruining the home for the spider, but also ruining my opportunity to get a photo here. So I'm going to make sure that I'm not getting too close, and then I'll get the camera turned on. And just to get started, I'll turn on my live view and adjust the position here, get my focus set so that I can actually see the spider web, and then look for a nice position here. First off, I want to try and make sure that I'm going to stay parallel, as it were. I'm going to have the lens orthogonal to the plane of that spider web so that all of the bits, all the pieces of the web will be about the same distance from the lens. And so the subject I find, I want it to be right in front of the lens. There we go. That looks pretty good. And then I'll fine tune my focus a little bit here and lock down the tripod, making sure that it's firmly positioned. For the spider web here, I don't have much behind it, and that's good because I won't have to worry about depth of field revealing clutter off in the background. I'm going to stop down. I think f16 or maybe even f22 should do the trick. I'm going to start off with f16. And I think just because I'm a little bit worried about motion, both the camera, because it's a little bit unstable here on the foliage, on the soft ground, and also because obviously that spider web can move around quite a bit in the breeze. So I'm going to increase my ISO to 400 to make sure that I can get a reasonably fast shutter speed. At f16, I'm still ending up with about 1/10 of a second exposure, so still a little bit slow, but there's no breeze at the moment. I don't think I'm going to have to worry too much about motion. I just want to try to get a reasonably fast shutter speed. I'll go ahead and connect the cable release, of course. This is always important for macro photography, but especially at the moment. Once again, the spider web is certainly able to move, but if I were to push the shutter release button on the camera, I would most certainly move the tripod just a little bit because of that soft ground. So I'll go ahead and get set up and take a quick test shot just to kind of evaluate. Well, the water droplets look great. The spider web is looking very nice. I like the overall composition. I like the way I have things framed up with the spider web going across the frame. The only trouble is, behind the spider web, there's a log, and it's rather bright, and it's just not a very good color to go along with the spider web. I'm going to take a couple of leaves, actually. There's some large, broad leaves that I've found here. And I think these will work well as a more natural backdrop for the spider web, for the water droplets on the spider web in particular. And so I'm going to take a couple of these, and with everything set, I'll double check, make sure that my focus is spot on and that my camera settings are exactly as I want them. And then I'm going to position the leaves behind the spider web, again being very careful not to touch, especially with my arm here or even with the leaves. I'll get the leaves positioned back behind as far away as possible just so that they won't be rendered in focus. And I'll hold them in position, and then using the cable release in my other hand, I'll go ahead and trigger the shutter. That looks much, much better. Now I have a texture of leaf, just a very subtle amount of texture. I've stopped down to f16 so I can see some striations in the leaf in the background, but overall it's all about the water droplets on that spider web with a nice clean background that has an appropriate color for the natural world where I'm photographing. So I've taken the time to carefully consider the setup, my position, and how I can creatively approach the subject, especially in this case. I can't move the subject, and so I need to try to find a way to deal with that background, but I've taken all of these pieces and put them together to produce a photograph that I'm happy with. I decided to come up to a higher elevation looking for different plants than those I had been finding down lower, and I was rewarded with a very interesting looking plant. It almost looks like it has berries on the end with tentacles growing out of it. I've never seen anything like it, and I decided that I would photograph it. As I was exploring around a little bit looking for a particular specimen to photograph, I also found a little beetle. I was trying to photograph that beetle. Unfortunately, he was moving around pretty quick, so I wasn't really able to get a good shot of him. So I'm back to these, it looks almost like some sort of flower that I'm going to photograph. I want to get really, really close in. The structure here is quite interesting, and so I want to look very close to create this almost abstract structure. I don't even know what it is. It looks interesting all by itself, but getting closer, I think it looks even more interesting. And so I'm using a 1x to 5x lens. This will really let me get in close, but I'm actually just going to operate at the 1x level, so 1x magnification. Because the light level is pretty low, it's overcast, it's getting late in the day, I don't have much light to work with, so I'm going to use a flash. I'm using the Twinlight macro flash here to illuminate the subject. That gives me a little bit more control, allows me to use a faster shutter speed so I don't have to worry about the motion of the plant and the breezes, and also helps me to stop down the lens so I can get greater depth of field. So that's going to prove really, really helpful in this case, I believe. I'm setting the camera up here at a 2/50th of a second shutter speed with f/16 as my aperture, and I'm using ISO 100. I'll go ahead and get myself framed up here, just fine-tuning my composition, and I also need to be very, very careful about focus. So I'll use the focusing rail here to dial in my focus, trying to get it as close to absolutely perfect as I can. And once I have that focus set, I'll lock the focusing rail just to make sure that I don't shift from that position. Because again, I'm really thinking about position to the subject. The closer I get versus farther away, that's going to change my focus. And so I think I'm good to go. The ground here is a little bit unstable. So with the tripod setup, I'm a bit concerned about movement. Almost certainly going to use that shutter release so that I don't have to worry too much about imparting any motion at all or changing up the framing for the subject. So I've got my lights set up here. I'll just fine tune the position of the Twinlight flash here, I think, and that should take care of it. I'll go ahead and trigger the shutter, and we'll take a look at the image here, and that looks to be pretty nice. I actually think I might fine tune the composition just a little bit. I'm just going to turn the ball head over to the right just a little bit. And with that adjusted, I'm going to refocus on the image. So I'll loosen up the lock on the focusing rail and then fine tune my focus. There we go, and lock it in one more time. And then I'll capture another shot and see what we've got there. That looks pretty good. I think I'd like to bounce a little bit of flash, more flash coming in from the right-hand side. So I actually have a sheet of blank paper that I can use here. Essentially a makeshift reflector. I'm going to hold that over here on the right hand side just to bounce some additional fill light over from the right. And that looks to be just great. I like that a lot. So I've got this abstract shape, this very interesting plant that I discovered, and by taking the time to get things set up just right and using a makeshift reflector, I've got a shot that I'm real happy with.